Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. John Matthews had always been drawn to the woods. It was an itch he couldn't scratch, a primal pull that went beyond mere curiosity. Growing up in the shadow of Tennessee's Cherokee National Forest, he'd learned to love the way the ancient trees seemed to whisper, how the air thickened with the smell of damp earth after a storm, and how the silence held a strange kind of weight, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the kind of silence you could easily ignore. It was alive with something beyond nature, something waiting. On a crisp, early autumn morning, John loaded up his truck, preparing for another metal-detecting trip with his son, Ben. The boy had been eager for weeks to find Civil War relics. The thought of holding something that had once touched the hands of soldiers filled him with the thrill of discovery. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he loaded his gear into the back of the truck, the sound of metal detectors and shovels clanging, together like the start of a grand adventure. "Think we'll find something today, Dad?" Ben asked, bouncing on the balls of his feet. John smiled. "If the forest is willing to give us something, then we'll find it. But you know, the forest never gives up its secrets easily." It was a strange thing, how he spoke about the forest. There was a reverence in his voice, a soft wariness that Ben couldn't quite place. John had always been that way. Some would call it superstition, but to Ben, it was just his dad being cautious, a man of reason who still believed there were things in this world you didn't provoke. They set off toward a part of the forest that John knew well, an isolated stretch where no one ventured. Most people stuck to the well-known trails, but John liked the quiet, the solitude of places untouched by other souls. Here the trees grew close together, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as though trying to hide something in their dense canopies. The air smelled different here, richer somehow. Less fresh, more ancient. As they trekked through the underbrush, Ben kept up a steady chatter, excited by the prospect of discovering something old, something historical. But John's mind wasn't on treasure. It was on the feeling that always settled over him in these parts, a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how many times he visited. It was as though the land itself was alive, watching, listening. He could almost hear the faint rustling of unseen things moving just beyond the trees, always out of sight, but never out of mind. They reached a clearing just as the sun began to rise high enough to cast long shadows on the ground. The forest felt still, too still. Not even the birds sang. John set up the metal detector, the faint hum of the device cutting through the thick silence. "You ready, Ben?" he asked, though his voice betrayed a small tremor. Ben didn't notice. He was already scanning the ground with the machine, eager to find that first beep that would lead them to their first find. The detector hummed and crackled, as if it was unsure what it was picking up. Then the unmistakable sharp sound of a strong signal. Ben's eyes widened. "Got something, Dad?" John stepped forward, his boots crunching the dry leaves. The excitement in Ben's voice was contagious, but John couldn't help the chill that crept along his spine. It was the wrong kind of excitement, the kind that gnawed at the edges of his senses, the kind that made him hesitate, made him wonder if they should just turn around and go home before things got out of hand. He brushed aside the thought and dropped to his knees, pulling his shovel from his belt. The ground was soft here, yielding to the blade with surprising ease. Within moments, the spade scraped against something harder. "A rock?" Ben asked, peering over his father's shoulder. John's brow furrowed. "I don't think so." He dug further, the earth turning in clumps until he hit wood, something smooth and solid. The air around them shifted. Not a breeze, not a sound, just a shift. Something deep in the earth responding to their touch. John wiped the sweat from his forehead, suddenly aware of how dry his mouth had become. He ran his hand over the object, pulling away the remaining soil. What lay beneath wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a coin or a bullet. It wasn't a relic of war, a simple piece of history lost to time. No, this was something different. A locket, a small tarnished piece of jewelry, broken and weathered by years, perhaps centuries, of burial beneath the forest floor. John held it in his palm, turning it over in his fingers. It was cracked, the metal corroded with age. What made it strange, though, wasn't just its appearance, it was the weight of it, the sense of wrongness, as though it had never belonged there, like it was never meant to be uncovered. Ben leaned in closer, peering at the locket. "What do you think it is?" John didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. He only knew that he didn't like the sensation crawling up his spine. But as a father, he had to be brave for his son. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. Just a locket. Someone must have dropped it years ago. It's probably not even that valuable. But the words felt hollow. A distant echo of something he was trying to convince himself of. Something in his gut told him to stop, to leave it there. But Ben's face lit up with the thrill of discovery, and John could do nothing but swallow the fear rising in his throat. Before he could say anything more, he heard it, a low creaking, like the sound of old wood under strain. The ground beneath them shifted, a sudden groan from deep within the earth, and then the unmistakable shape of something dark and large began to emerge, half buried beneath the soil. It wasn't just a locket, it was something far worse. The earth beneath them groaned once more, as if protesting the very act of uncovering its secrets. John stood frozen, staring down at the dark shape slowly revealing itself from the soil, his hand still gripping the locket. The sound of the metal detector's hum now felt far too loud, too insistent. Ben, oblivious to his father's growing unease, was already scrambling to uncover the object further, the boy's eagerness filling the air like a palpable force. "Let's dig it out. It could be something amazing," Ben said, his voice ringing with excitement. His shovel sliced into the ground with a confident rhythm, moving the dirt aside as if he were merely searching for treasure. But John, he wasn't so sure. There was something about this presence in the earth, something that felt wrong, too wrong to ignore. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He had never been superstitious. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy or to unexplained fears, but even he couldn't deny the strange sensation pressing on him, a weight that seemed to push him deeper into the earth with every passing second. His hands trembled slightly, betraying his attempt at calm. "Ben, hold on," he said, his voice low but firm. He grabbed his son's arm before the boy could dig any deeper. "We need to be careful." Ben shot him a confused glance but didn't argue. Instead, he straightened up, brushing the sweat from his forehead. "Careful? What, you think we're going to hit a snake or something?" John swallowed the dry lump in his throat. "No, it's not that. It's just..." He paused. He wanted to say more, but the words stuck in his chest. "Let's just take a step back." But it was too late. The metal detector had gone wild in his hands, its shrill beep piercing the tension in the air. It sounded like a warning now, sharp and insistent, a steady rhythm that set John's nerves on edge. His eyes flicked to the device as it flashed, wildly, the needle jumping with such intensity that it felt almost alive. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to Ben, but the boy had already dropped to his knees, his fingers working feverishly at the loose soil. Something about Ben's eagerness, his unflinching curiosity, sent a fresh jolt of panic through John's chest. "Ben, listen to me," John tried again, voice trembling now, though he hid it well. "We need to stop. There's something wrong here. I can feel it." Ben glanced up at his father, a quizzical expression on his face. Stop? But we're this close to something huge. Come on, this could be a major find. John could feel his heart hammering in his chest as he scanned the trees, the thick trunk standing silent and watchful, the forest, which had felt so strangely still earlier, now seemed suffocating, pressing in from all sides. He imagined eyes in the shadows, hidden between the gnarled bark, watching them with silent intent. The air was growing heavier, thicker, with each breath, as if the very land was conspiring against them. His stomach churned. The beeping of the detector escalated, as though the device itself was losing control, frantic and unrelenting. And still, despite his father's warnings, Ben pushed forward. It was as if some invisible force was urging him on, a tug at the back of his mind, pulling him deeper into the earth, deeper into the mystery of the grave they had uncovered. Finally, Ben's hands hit something solid. It was cold, too cold. He yanked his hands back in shock, staring at what had just been exposed, a set of wooden planks, aged and blackened with decay. John felt a wave of nausea roll over him. "Is that—" Ben began, but his voice trailed off as he recoiled, realizing what they were really digging into. That's a coffin," John said, his voice strained, his throat tightening with unease. "A coffin." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like smoke rising from a smouldering fire. A small coffin, the wood worn and decomposed by years, maybe centuries, of rest in the earth. But even more unsettling was the chain wrapped around it, old and rusted, so thick it was impossible to miss. It seemed to have been carefully wound around the rotting wood, as if someone had gone to great lengths to keep whatever lay inside. It sealed away. The rust on the chain seemed fresh, almost like it had been touched only days ago. John felt a shiver crawl up his spine, one that had nothing to do with the chilly morning air. His mouth went dry. Something about this felt deeply wrong. No one in their right mind would have buried something in a place like this, not with such care, unless it was meant to stay hidden, locked away. For good. "Ben," John said, trying to keep his voice steady, "we need to leave, right now." But Ben, ever the optimist, didn't hear the urgency in his father's voice. He reached for the rusted chain, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. "We can't leave now. We've found something amazing. We have to see what's inside." "No," John hissed, panic flooding his voice. "You don't understand. Whatever's in there, whatever this is, it's not something we should mess with." Ben stared at him in disbelief. "You're not serious, are you? We've come this far. We've—" "Got to open it, Dad." John's stomach turned at the thought. His instinct screamed at him to run, to leave this place and never return. But Ben was already tugging at the chain, trying to pull it loose. It was then that John felt it, that overwhelming, creeping sensation that had been lingering in the back of his mind, now surging forward with terrifying clarity. The forest had gone deathly still. The air felt thick with tension, like a storm was about to break. But it wasn't a storm of rain. It was a storm of watching eyes. He froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. The trees around them seemed to bend inward, casting long shadows that stretched far, too quickly. The silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself had turned against them. And then, faintly, barely audible over the frantic beeping of the metal detector, he heard it, a whisper, a soft, cold voice carried on the wind, drifting through the trees. At first he thought it was the wind, the rustling of leaves, but then he heard it again, clearer this time, louder. "Leave. Now." John's blood ran cold, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. The whisper came from all directions, at once, like it was coming from the very earth beneath his feet, the trees around them, the air itself. Ben, oblivious, continued to pry at the chain, oblivious to the voice, to the shift in the atmosphere. "Dad, it's just a whisper." Probably some animal or the wind. Don't be so jumpy. But John wasn't listening anymore. His mind raced, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was going to burst from his chest. The forest wasn't just silent, it was waiting. He reached for Ben's arm. "Ben, listen to me. We need to go now." But before he could say anything else, the sound of a snap rang out, sharp and final. The rusted chain, worn thin by time and neglect, gave way. The coffin lid shifted, creaking open with a sound so loud it echoed across the forest, like the earth itself was groaning in protest. And then a smell. The sickening, putrid stench of rot, decay, and something far worse filled the air. John's blood ran cold. The lid had cracked open just enough for him to see. Something was inside, something alive. The air in the forest had shifted. Something had changed. The oppressive weight that John felt on his chest was no longer just a sensation. It was tangible, pressing down on him like a physical force. His hands trembled, slick with cold sweat, as he reached for Ben's arm, pulling him back from the coffin that now creaked open, revealing whatever lay inside. But Ben resisted, his face full of wide-eyed wonder. "Dad, look, it's opening. Something's inside. We have to see it." His voice held a mix of excitement and disbelief, as if he were witnessing the discovery of a lifetime. John's eyes were locked on the now gaping lid. The darkness inside the coffin seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing, alive with something, ancient and malevolent. He could almost hear it, something stirring within, something that had been silent for so long. But now it was waking. The dark shape inside seemed to shift, a shadow within shadows, the air around it thickening. The stench of decay was so overwhelming that John gagged, fighting the bile that rose in his throat. It was a smell unlike anything he had ever encountered, a mixture of old rot, dead earth, and something else. Something fetid and unnatural. He looked at Ben, who was still crouched beside the coffin, eyes wide with a kind of innocent curiosity that made John's blood run cold. "Ben, please get away from it," John pleaded, his voice raw with fear. "This isn't right. We're not supposed to open this. We need to leave." But Ben didn't seem to hear him. His hand hovered over the edge of the coffin, his fingers twitching, with an eagerness John had never seen in him before. "But Dad, there's something in there. We can't just leave it like this. This could be worth so much. This could be something no one's ever seen before." John's heart sank. The boy was no longer speaking like himself, like a child who could understand the danger. There was a strange gleam in his eyes now, something distant, as if he were under a spell, or worse, like something was pulling him toward that darkness. And then it happened. The coffin lid shifted, just a little more. John could hear the scraping of wood against wood, the sound of ancient hinges creaking under the strain of whatever force was pushing from within. The shadows inside deepened, the air thickening in, a way that made his skin crawl. Ben's breath caught, and his hand, now trembling, brushed against the lid. That was all it took. The lid snapped open with a deafening crack. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw was enough to freeze him to the core, enough to freeze the very blood in his veins. Inside the coffin lay a body, but it wasn't like any body he'd ever seen before. It was wrong, twisted. The skin had long since decayed into nothing but a thin, papery shell, mottled and stretched across the bones beneath. But it wasn't the body that made his stomach lurch. It was the eyes. The eyes were still there, sunken and blackened, but they stared straight ahead, locked into something. John couldn't look away. It was like the body was aware of them, aware that they were there, that they were watching it. A chill ran through him as he felt the gaze of the corpse. Though the eyes were dead, hollow, there was something else there, something alive. The emptiness seemed to call to him, like a void trying to suck him in. And then, as if the body itself had been waiting for this moment, it began to move. Just a little at first, a faint shift beneath the rotting skin, and then the faintest of sounds, like a wheeze, a whisper of breath. John's vision blurred. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed with terror, unable to tear his eyes away from the corpse that seemed to wait before them. "Ben, get back," John whispered hoarsely, reaching for his son. But the boy was no longer responding. Ben's face had changed. His expression had gone vacant, his eyes wide, staring at the corpse in a way that sent a rush of fear through John's veins. He tried again, this time his hand gripping Ben's arm tightly. "Ben! Ben!" The boy blinked and slowly, almost sluggishly, turned to his father. For a moment, there was nothing in his eyes, a blankness, and then, as if returning from a trance, Ben's lips curled into a smile, a strange, unsettling smile. I want to touch it," Ben said, his voice low, almost hollow, as if he were no longer fully himself. "I need to touch it. I can feel it calling to me, Dad." "No, Ben!" John's voice cracked with desperation. He yanked the boy back, nearly throwing him to the ground in his haste. "We're leaving now. I don't care what's in that thing. It's not worth it. Do you hear me?" Ben stumbled back, a confused look crossing his face. What's wrong with you, Dad? It's just a body. It's just something old. We can't leave without knowing." But before Ben could finish his sentence, the corpse inside the coffin jerked. A loud, guttural sound, like the crack of dried bones snapping under strain, echoed through the clearing. The air grew thick, impossibly heavy. The shadows seemed to stretch, as though something was pushing out from the earth itself. And then the stench, that awful stench, grew unbearable. John's stomach turned as he was hit with the scent of something far worse than death. And then, in a horrible instant, the eyes of the corpse flashed. It wasn't just a flicker, like a dead man's gaze lost in time. It was alive. The darkness inside those eyes felt like it reached out, pulling at his very soul. The space around them seemed to warp, like the trees themselves bent inward, groaning as though in pain. Ben let out a breathless, strangled laugh. "Do you see it, Dad? It's real. It's alive." John's heart slammed in his chest as the ground beneath them trembled. The earth seemed to churn and quake, as if something deep below was stirring, something that had been kept buried for a reason. Ben's smile widened. "It's not a body. It's a thing that was never meant to be buried, a thing that needs to be free." The ground beneath them shifted, and the very air crackled with the sound of an ancient energy awakening. John pulled Ben back, struggling to get him away from the coffin, but it was like trying to drag him away from a force beyond this world. And then the voice came again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer, stronger. "Leave, now." But it wasn't the forest that was speaking anymore. It was it. John's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He had to get Ben out of here. He had to escape. But as he turned, pulling Ben away from the grave, he saw something in the distance, something dark, moving between the trees. A figure, tall, hunched, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. The forest wasn't watching them anymore. It was waiting. The forest was no longer still. It was alive. Alive in a way that made John's every instinct scream for him to run. The trees twisted and groaned in the wind, their limbs stretching toward the clearing where the coffin lay. The dark, unnerving figure between the trees moved again, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew that it had all the time in the world. But John didn't have time. He tugged at Ben's arm, desperate to pull him away, but the boy resisted. his feet planted firmly in place. Ben's expression was vacant, his face pale, as though the light had drained from his eyes. His lips were parted in a soft, breathless murmur, like he was speaking to something only he could hear. "It's calling to me, Dad," Ben whispered, his voice far too calm for the situation. "It's asking me to come closer. I think I'm supposed to help it." John's heart twisted. Ben's words were far from the playful curiosity of a child exploring a simple treasure hunt. His son's tone was distant, hollow, as though his body were merely a vessel being pulled in a direction beyond his control. It was as if something deep inside him, something dark and ancient, had awoken, and it had claimed him. "No," John gasped, pulling harder on his son's arm, trying to drag him away from the coffin. "No, Ben, listen to me. Whatever this thing is, it's not you anymore. You have to fight it. Please, Ben." But Ben only tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in a strange, predatory way, a smile twisting his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but something darker, something unholy. "It's not a thing, Dad. It's not a thing at all. It's alive. It's waiting." John's chest tightened. The words churned in his mind. Alive. That's what they had feared, wasn't it? That the thing in the grave, the thing wrapped in rusted chains and buried beneath the earth for so long, wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past. It was something more, something that had been sealed away for a reason. And now that reason was coming back. The shadows around them deepened, and the rustling in the trees grew louder, almost like the forest itself was closing in. The figure in the distance, tall, twisted, its shape barely visible in the gloom, moved. Closer, its glowing eyes fixed on John and Ben. The air was so thick, so dense, that each breath felt like an effort. John stumbled back, pulling Ben with him, but the boy didn't seem to notice. Ben's face remained blank, eyes wide but unfocused, as if he was seeing something in the distance, something far beyond the forest. "Ben, please," John said, his voice breaking. "I'm not losing you. You're my son. You're my boy." For a moment, Ben's expression flickered, like a shadow passing over his face, but then, just as quickly, the blankness returned. It was as if Ben was there, but not there, as though the child he had known, the child who had been his whole world, had slipped into some dark place from which there was no return. John's breath hitched as he turned to face the figure that had been moving between the trees. It was close now, closer than he had ever expected. The trees seemed to bend in its wake, the ground groaning beneath its steps. It was tall, too tall for a human being, and its shape was so contorted, its limbs unnaturally long, that it looked more like some twisted shadow than a man. Its eyes, they glowed, not with light, but with an inky blackness that seemed to pull in the surrounding light, swallowing it whole. "No," John whispered, as the figure took another step forward. Its presence was suffocating, an invisible weight that pressed down on his chest and shoulders. He felt the air itself shift, the atmosphere thickening with dread. The creature, whatever it was so close now that he could feel the cold emanating from it. It spoke. "It is mine." The voice was not a sound, but a feeling, a vibration, that seemed to come from within the earth itself. It reverberated through John's bones, thrumming in his chest like an insistent drumbeat. The voice was ancient. It was wrong. It carried with it a hunger, an overwhelming thirst that could not be sated. And it wasn't talking to him. It was talking to Ben. The figure stepped forward again, moving unnaturally, like it was both there and not there, flickering between the shadows. It raised a hand, long and thin, its fingers twisting like the roots of a dead tree. It reached out toward Ben. John's heart stuttered. "Ben!" Ben turned toward the figure, his smile widening. His eyes were dark, empty voids now. The boy's gaze met John's for just a brief moment. And for the first time, John saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of his son beneath the hollow shell. But it was fleeting, disappearing almost instantly as Ben took a step forward toward the creature. "Dad, I have to help it," Ben said, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he had been possessed by something else. "It needs me. I'm the one. It's been waiting for—" "No! No!" John screamed, his voice hoarse with panic. The figure's shadowed form began to ripple, as if the very air around it was warping and twisting. The forest was no longer silent. The trees groaned, the wind howled, and the metal detector, still lying discarded on the ground, began to hum again, as if it too was sensing the change. The earth beneath them trembled, shaking violently, as if the very ground wanted to spit them out. Ben took another step, the smile still fixed on his face, and the creature raised its hand higher. The air grew cold, too cold. John reached out for his son, but Ben jerked away, his body stiffening like he had become a puppet in the hands of something far darker. His legs moved on their own accord, carrying him toward the creature in a trance-like state. And John, helpless, powerless to stop him, watched in terror. "Ben, no!" John shouted, reaching out with desperate hands. He took one more step forward, but the moment his foot landed on the ground, the earth beneath him buckled. A crack split open the earth, a deep, dark rift opening between him and his son. Ben fell, but the creature did not. The ground shuddered, a loud cracking sound echoing around them as if the earth itself was splitting open, trying to free the thing buried beneath. The cracks stretched wider, and John was forced to stumble backward, nearly losing his balance. But Ben, the boy he had once known, was gone. Not in body, not in spirit, but in soul. The creature reached its long arm across the rift, fingers stretching unnaturally far, and it whispered again, "It is time." John's chest tightened as a roar of wind swept through the forest, spinning leaves and dust in all directions. He reached out, his mind racing, but before he could move any further, he heard the unmistakable sound of something being pulled from the earth, a terrible, wet slap. The coffin, now completely opened, had disgorged its contents, the thing inside, lifting itself from the grave with a screech that reverberated through John's entire body. The thing was alive. It was no longer a corpse. It was something else, something new. But the true horror was not in what it looked like. It was in the fact that it was alive and it was calling. And Ben was walking right into its arms. The ground beneath John's feet trembled again, more violently this time, sending cracks racing out in every direction like veins of fear spreading through the earth. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. The trees, their limbs twisted and reaching, swayed unnaturally, casting long, grotesque shadows across the clearing. The wind whistled, but it was no longer the soft, comforting breeze of the forest. It was sharp, biting, a whisper of something malicious that had finally broken free. John's pulse thudded in his ears as he watched his son move further toward the creature. Ben's movements were jerky, like a marionette pulled by strings that were invisible to him. His face had gone beyond the blankness, beyond the hollow stare. Now there was only a rapture, a glazed expression that twisted the features of his once innocent face into something unnatural. It was as if Ben had lost all sense of self and had become part of something far older, far darker. "No, Ben, please!" John cried, his voice raw, ragged. He reached out for his son, but the crack in the earth between them had grown too wide, too deep. He couldn't get closer. There was no way around it. Ben's lips moved, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Dad, it's okay. It's time. We have to set it free. I'm the one it's been waiting for." John's throat constricted, as if something icy had wrapped itself around his heart. He wanted to scream, wanted to run and grab Ben, pull him back to safety. But the darkness pressing in around him felt like a physical barrier. It held him in place. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The creature, no, the thing, towered in front of Ben now, its shape growing clearer as the last of the fog lifted. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, each joint twisting unnaturally in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its skin was stretched and pale, like a membrane stretched over the bones of a forgotten god. Its face was a twisted, malformed thing, devoid of eyes, its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin that seemed to split its face in two. Teeth, too many teeth, jutted out from its mouth, sharp and glistening like daggers. John staggered back, his hand clutching his chest. As the air grew colder, the presence of the creature swallowing every last ounce of warmth. The thing's hands, each one impossibly long and bony, reached out toward Ben, its fingers curling like claws. But it didn't touch him. Not yet. It hovered there, as though it was savoring the moment, savoring the slow descent of its chosen. Ben seemed to lean into the creature's grasp, as though he was already part of it, as though he were no longer even human. He had become the vessel it had waited for, the one it had called to all these years. John's heart pounded harder, louder, his legs trembling under him, his throat burned, and for a split second, he felt like he was suffocating. Ben. His voice was barely a whisper now, a choked sob that fought its way up his throat. "I'm sorry." But Ben did not hear him. The thing's voice rippled through the air, low and reverberating, echoing in the very bones of the forest. It didn't need to speak aloud. The words crawled into John's mind, worming their way into his thoughts, slithering deep into his consciousness. It was like a terrible song played on a harp made of suffering. You cannot stop this. It is time. The pact is sealed. The words were not for him, but for Ben. It was speaking to him, guiding him, pulling him closer. John's chest tightened even more, the sound of his heart slamming against his ribs deafening in his ears. The creature's grip on Ben was growing stronger, pulling the boy toward its twisted, gaping mouth. John fell to his knees, his fingers clawing at the dirt, his eyes locked on Ben as the boy seemed to float toward the thing. And then something happened. Ben turned. For the first time, he looked directly at his father, his eyes no longer vacant, no longer lost. "Dad," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm scared." John's heart broke. He could see it now, a flash of the boy he knew beneath the layers of whatever dark force had taken him. There was something left, something human in that fragile whisper. The pain in Ben's eyes was all too clear, but it was fleeting, swallowed by the shadow that now consumed him. "No, Ben," John cried out, reaching for him once more. But the creature laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the air and made the ground beneath him shake. It wasn't a laugh of joy, it was a laugh of power, of control. It was a laugh that made John feel small, insignificant. The time for human weakness is over. Before John could react, the ground beneath him shifted. The crack in the earth widened even further, and with it, the oppressive weight of the forest grew stronger, more suffocating. The trees creaked and groaned in the unnatural wind. And then, from the depths of the earth itself, something began to rise. John stumbled back, his feet slipping as the earth cracked open with a deafening roar. The thing that had been buried for so long was coming back. It was coming back, and it was no longer content to remain in the shadows. From the depths, a massive form began to emerge, a shadow made of nightmares. Its shape was too massive to comprehend, too vast for John's mind to fully grasp. It seemed to blot out the very light of the world, swallowing everything in its path. For a moment, the sky above was blotted out by a storm of swirling shadows and darkness. And then, as it finally broke the surface, it was revealed. It wasn't just a creature, It was an entity, ancient and unrelenting, something that had existed long before the first trees had sprouted from the earth, something that had shaped the world with its hunger. It was a thing that had no form, but existed in all forms, in shadows, in whispers, in the very air around them. It was the Earth's darkest secret, the thing the Cherokee had spoken of in hushed tones, the thing they had fought to keep hidden for centuries, and now it was free. The creature reached out, its skeletal hand curling around Ben's neck, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The boy's eyes went wide with terror, but there was no fight left in him. His body hung limply in the creature's grasp. John's breath caught in his throat. The thing had Ben. It was taking him, taking his son, his flesh and blood, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then, in the midst of the horror, something inside John snapped. He wasn't going to lose Ben, not like this. Not to whatever this was. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. John struggled to his feet, his legs shaking, his heart pounding so violently that it seemed to reverberate through his entire body. The thing in front of him was massive, but John had no choice. He couldn't let it take his son. He stepped forward, ignoring the fear that threatened to paralyze him, pushing past the suffocating weight of the shadows that surrounded him. He reached into his jacket pocket, his hand trembling as it closed around. The cold metal detector, the device now an unlikely weapon, had begun to hum again. The beeping grew louder, faster, as though it recognized something that even John didn't understand. He raised it, aiming the detector at the creature as its long fingers wrapped around Ben's throat. The hum grew deafening, so loud it drowned out everything else. And then the metal detector spoke, not with words, but with a sound so piercing, so unnatural, that it felt like a scream from deep within the earth itself. The thing recoiled, the grip around Ben's neck tightening. But the child, now gasping for air, wasn't entirely gone. His mouth opened, but the words that escaped were no longer his own. "I must pay." And John, heart in his throat, realized that the true cost of freedom was not his life. It was his son's. John's mind raced, spinning with panic and desperation, but at the same time, something else, something primal, was beginning to emerge from deep within him. A quiet, almost forgotten instinct buried beneath years of fatherly love and mundane concerns. He had no choice now. The thing, the creature, had taken Ben, but there was a way out. There had to be. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if the very space between them had become a barrier. His hands trembled, his chest tight with fear, but his eyes were clear. They were filled with purpose. His son was slipping away, and if John didn't act now, he would lose him forever. There was no room for hesitation, no more second chances. The creature's gaping maw opened wider, and the ground beneath them groaned as the dark shadows from below continued to twist and shift. The air shimmered with a kind of unnatural heat, like a furnace slowly creeping toward them. The cold was gone now. Instead, it was a deep, suffocating warmth, the warmth of something alive in a way no living creature should be. The metal detector in John's hand hummed louder and faster, as if it recognized the approaching darkness. It rattled in his grip, its low whistling sound turning to something more violent, more insistent. The thing, or whatever it was, hissed in pain, as though it had been stung by the device's shrill cry. The vibrations it made were powerful, but the creature's grip on Ben didn't loosen. No, if anything, it tightened. "Give him to me." The voice slithered into John's ears again. It was a low, guttural sound that resonated with ancient power, a whisper from the very bowels of the earth. The thing's form flickered, stretching and warping like an image reflected in broken glass. It was now both more and less than what John had first seen. A thing that had been bound for centuries, and whose power was only now beginning to awaken, fully. Ben, his body limp, was barely able to make a sound, but John could see the terror in his eyes, the fight in his son that refused to die. Ben's lips parted, and though his voice was barely more than a rasp, it was still his own. "Dad, don't let it win. Please." John felt a jolt of pain in his chest, something so sharp and sudden that he nearly stumbled. It was the pain of knowing that no matter how much he wanted to save his son, there was something far darker, far older, lurking in the depths of this forest. Something that had been calling for years, waiting for the right moment, the right vessel. But Ben had said it. There was a way out. Give him to me. John understood. The creature didn't want just Ben, it wanted the sacrifice. And the only way to stop it, the only way to break its hold, was to give up what it wanted most. Give up Ben. John's heart shattered at the very thought. His hands trembled violently, the weight of the metal detector growing heavier with each passing second. He could feel the creature's power pressing in on him, bending his mind and his will to its whims. Every part of him screamed for him to stop, to fight, to save Ben. But deep down, he knew. He knew what had to be done. The shadows around them grew darker still, twisting into shapes that were not quite human, that moved unnaturally, like spirits of the dead made flesh. The thing's form seemed to fragment and reassemble itself, like it was breaking apart, dissolving, and then reforming in new shapes, a crawling, slithering mass of limbs, teeth, and eyes. Its whispers flooded John's mind. "You cannot stop. Me, I am the forest, I am the earth. You will offer what I desire, or you will both be consumed." John's hand gripped the metal detector tighter, the buzzing intensifying as it clashed with the thing's presence. He stumbled forward, his legs giving way under him as he moved closer to the creature. The rift in the earth was growing wider. It seemed as though the earth itself was pulling away from them, offering them up as sacrifices to whatever lay beneath. The warmth was unbearable now. The dark thing loomed over Ben, its body curling around his son like a serpent wrapping its coils tighter with every passing second. And that's when John saw it, the locket, the rusted, broken locket that had been unearthed by the metal detector when they first began digging. It was still there, half buried beneath the edge of the now split earth, its broken, tarnished surface glinting faintly in the unnatural light. The locket, once a symbol of love, of remembrance, was the key. It had been the catalyst that had brought all this to fruition. It was no simple relic. The locket, John realized now, was the anchor, the thing that had held the creature bound for so long, and now it was time to let it go. John stumbled to his knees, his hand reaching for the locket, his fingers cold as ice against its surface. As soon as his fingers brushed the tarnished metal, the world seemed to shudder. The rift opened wider. The earth groaned with something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries to be freed. The creature hissed, its claws scraping the ground like the sound of nails against a chalkboard. It thrashed, its limbs twitching as if it could sense the weakening of the bond, the final moment of freedom that was about to come. John didn't hesitate. The metal detector's hum grew deafening as he turned it toward the locket. The sound became a shriek, louder and sharper, like the wail of 1,000 voices trapped beneath the earth. And with that, John threw himself forward, smashing the locket against the ground, grinding it into the earth beneath him. The creature let out a roar, a deafening hollow cry that seemed to shatter the very fabric of reality. Its body twitched and spasmed violently, like something not meant to be, not meant to exist, being torn apart from within. The rift in the earth expanded, pulling the creature's form into the gaping void, but it wasn't enough. John had to finish it. With every ounce of strength he could muster, John tore the metal detector from the ground, and as the thing began to recoil, he slammed it down against the creature's writhing form. The device's humming exploded into an ear-piercing screech, a sound so shrill and terrible that it was almost unbearable. Ben screamed. The creature screeched, and then the earth split open, the ground gave way, and the creature's form, its massive, terrifying body, was swallowed whole, consumed by the darkness beneath. Its body dissolved into the blackness, like ink vanishing into water, until all that was left was the emptiness. The rumbling stopped. The shaking ceased, and the silence that followed was deafening. John fell to his knees, his body heavy with exhaustion, his breath ragged and shallow. The metal detector fell from his hand and clattered to the ground beside him. His chest burned, his mind foggy, his vision blurring as he looked up. Ben lay on the ground, crumpled but alive. John crawled to him, his heart beating so loudly it felt like it might burst from his chest. He rolled Ben over gently, his eyes scanning, his son's face, hoping, praying. Ben's eyes fluttered open, groggy and confused, but alive. "Dad?" Ben whispered, his voice weak but real. "What happened?" John let out a sob of relief, pulling his son close to him, holding him tighter than he ever had before. "You're safe now, Ben. You're safe." But as John clutched his son, he knew, he could feel it. Something had changed. The forest around them was still, but it was no longer the same. There was a lingering presence, a shadow that hung in the air. The creature was gone, but the mark it left remained, and there was no telling how long that mark would last. John could only wonder what had been freed in its place. The forest seemed to exhale with an unnatural calm, the kind of stillness that comes only after a violent storm has passed, leaving only the wreckage in its wake. The trees, once trembling with energy and ancient rage, now stood silent, as though even they were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to disturb the eerie peace. John sat in the dirt, his back pressed against a tree, feeling the rough bark dig into his skin as he held Ben close. His son's trembling body seemed to soak in the relief, but John knew that relief was fleeting. That feeling, the one of peace, was not something that could last. It wasn't the calm after a storm. It was the calm before the new terror began to take root. Ben's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals. He was alive, yes, but he wasn't the same. There was something different in his eyes, a dullness that had not been there before. Something he had seen, something he had felt, had been etched into him, leaving a permanent shadow on his soul. "Dad," Ben whispered, his voice cracking like the earth they had just escaped. "What was that thing? What was it?" John swallowed hard, his throat tight. The question was simple, but the answer, it was more complex than anything he could put into words. The creature, the entity, was not just a monster buried beneath the earth. It had been a guardian of sorts, holding something far worse at bay. But in freeing it, they had only replaced one nightmare with another. "I don't know, Ben," John said, his voice barely more than a hoarse rasp. "But we can't stop now. Whatever it was, it's not gone. It's still here, in the forest, and it's waiting." Ben shuddered in his arms, but John could feel his son clinging to him, desperate for something, anything, that would reassure him, that would tell him it was safe to go home. But the truth was, John didn't know if they could go home. Not anymore. Not after what had been unleashed. The locket. The metal detector. The thing they had uncovered beneath the earth. John couldn't shake the image of the locket, the rusted, broken relic of the past. It had been part of something older, something darker, something tied to the very land beneath their feet. But now, in the wake of the creature's defeat, John realized it wasn't just the creature that had been freed. The land itself, the forest, had woken. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, a low, insidious rumble that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand on end. The trees around them groaned, their limbs swaying like tortured souls reaching out to grasp them. And there it was again, an unsettling whisper, one that curled around the edges of John's mind like a cold finger tracing his thoughts. You cannot run. You will never leave. The sound was coming from the earth itself, echoing through the soil, the rocks, the very air around them. It wasn't the creature. No, this was something older, something that ruled the land, the trees, the dirt, the riverbeds. The very forest was speaking to them. A low growl rumbled from somewhere deep in the woods. A shadow passed over them, though there was no light, no sun to cast it. It felt wrong, like a dark cloud crossing the sky, swallowing the very air. John stood, pulling Ben with him, his grip firm around his son's arm. They were not safe, not yet, and he knew deep down in his bones that there was more to the forest than they could comprehend. The ground cracked again, splitting wider beneath their feet. The edges of the rift, the one that had swallowed the creature, were still visible, a jagged scar stretching across the earth. John couldn't help but stare at it. That was where it had come from, the thing that had torn at the fabric of the world, the creature that had reached into their lives, into their flesh, and changed everything. And now something even worse was waiting. The trees were moving. At first, it was just a few branches, bending unnaturally toward them, reaching out as though with a mind of their own. Then the ground trembled again, and John saw it, the silhouette of something far larger than any tree. The branches weren't just moving, they were reaching. "Dad!" Ben gasped, his voice trembling. "What is that?" John's heart sank as he looked at his son's wide, frightened eyes. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't explain the ancient force that now seemed to own this place, a force that had always been here, beneath the trees, beneath the soil, waiting, slumbering for someone to wake it. "Get back!" John shouted, yanking Ben toward him. But the words barely left his mouth before the earth beneath them shifted again, sending them both stumbling backward. The trees were no longer just trees. They had become something else, hungry, ancient, and vast. They twisted and bent in ways that trees should not. Some of the trunks were cracking open, revealing hollow, gaping mouths filled with jagged teeth, mouths that seemed to breathe, to pulse with life. And from the depths of the forest, something far more terrible stirred. John's mind screamed to move, to run, to get out of there. But it was already too late. They were surrounded. The trees were closing in on them, each step an effort to keep the ground from giving way beneath their feet. The air smelled of wet earth, of decay, of something old that had been buried too long. Ben, eyes wide with terror, tried to pull away. "Dad, I can't breathe. I can't..." His words were cut off by a terrifying scream. A sound so raw, so primal, it felt as if it had come from the earth itself, as if the very forest was crying out in pain. And then a shape, a silhouette, emerged from the shadows. It wasn't a man, nor a beast. It wasn't even a creature that could be described in any simple terms. It was a thing, a vast, writhing mass of roots and limbs, of gnarled bark and twisted flesh. It moved like liquid shadow, its form constantly shifting and contorting. And at the center of it all was a face so ancient, so twisted, that it could not belong to any living being. The eyes, those eyes, were dark pits, black as the void, hollow and endless. The thing spoke, not with words, but with a deep, rumbling growl that shook the very ground beneath them. "You woke me." The world seemed to collapse around John. The whispers of the forest grew louder, twisting together into one deafening roar of hunger. The trees, the earth, the wind, it was all alive now, alive with wrath, alive with a vengeance. The ancient force, the thing that had been waiting beneath their feet, had awoken, and it wanted one thing: to feed. Ben screamed. But it was too late. John's hand reached for his son, pulling him closer, trying to shield him from the growing shadow that stretched out toward them. The earth split again, the rift expanding, but this time there was no escape. The ground was swallowing them whole, and the trees were coming for them. And in the distance, beyond the twisting trunks and gnarled branches, the whispered words of the forest echoed one final time. You will never leave. The rift in the earth widened further, like a mouth yawning open, eager to swallow everything in its path. The air was thick, oppressive, filled with the heavy scent of decay, of wet soil and something much darker, older. It wasn't just the trees. The very land itself seemed alive with a malevolent force, a sentience that stretched from the roots of the trees deep into the ground beneath their feet. It had been awakened, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed everything. John's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, desperate for some plan, some way out. But the ground kept moving, groaning as if it had a life of its own. The earth was shaking beneath their feet, sending tremors through his legs, his spine. The very soil seemed to fight against him, as if reaching for his feet, trying to pull him into its depths. The thing before them, a monstrosity of roots and limbs, towered over them, its form a grotesque fusion of plant and something darker. Its body seemed to shift between tree and human, limbs twisting in unnatural angles, roots creeping through the ground, pulling at the earth like it was attempting to tear reality itself apart. And its face, if one could call it a face, was an abomination. Twisted bark and jagged glowing eyes that flickered with ancient, unfathomable malice. Ben, trembling beside him, gasped for breath. His eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on the thing, the entity that stood before them, the thing that was the forest. "Dad," Ben whispered, his voice choked with fear. "What is it? What do we do?" John wanted to tell him that it was okay, that they could find a way out of this, that they could escape. But he knew deep down that there was no escape from this. The forest was the trap, and the trap had closed. "Don't know," John muttered, his voice hoarse and cracking. His eyes never left the creature. The thing watched them, its glowing eyes narrowing as if savoring their fear. It spoke without moving its lips, without sound, but the words reverberated through John's skull like a low, vibrating hum. "You freed me." The air seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up as the trees around them began to bend, their trunks groaning in protest. The shadows deepened, stretching out like fingers wrapping themselves around them. The whispers from the earth grew louder, more frantic. John felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. His thoughts felt muddled, as though something was tugging at his mind, trying to unravel him from the inside out. The creature's form began to change again, its bark-like skin cracking and peeling, revealing something ancient beneath it, something alive, something that was not human. Beneath the bark, John could see glowing veins of light pulsing through the thing's body, like the very lifeblood of the forest coursing through it. And its face, God, that face. It twisted as though the thing was shedding its skin, revealing a deeper, darker version of itself, something that should not be. It was growing. The realization hit John like a physical blow. The entity wasn't simply alive, it was feeding. It was evolving. And as it evolved, it was becoming something far worse. Ben's voice cut through John's panic, his fingers gripping his father's sleeve. "Dad, what do we do? Please, I don't want to die here, please." But John had no answer. How could he? What could he say? Nothing they did would stop it. Nothing could defeat the thing that had lived beneath the earth for so long. The only thing that had kept it at bay was the locket, the broken relic they had unearthed. And now it was gone, shattered into nothingness, leaving the forest wide open to whatever darkness had been waiting. Whatever it had been waiting for, John wasn't sure he wanted to know. But he did know one thing. The creature was still speaking to them. And this time, the voice was louder, clearer, more human. I am the keeper of all that lies beneath this land. I am the earth's will made flesh. I am the hunger that lies dormant beneath every stone, every root. And now that you have woken me. The thing's voice was a low rumble, like thunder reverberating through the trees. You shall feed me. John's pulse raced, adrenaline surging. As he tried to think, tried to move, he looked around desperately for an escape. But the trees, no, the forest, had surrounded them completely. The roots were rising, creeping like snakes, twining around their legs, pulling them toward the ground. Every step felt heavier, as if the earth itself was dragging them down into its depths. John felt his heart skip as a cold, iron grip closed around his ankle. And then the ground split open once again, wider this time. The air stank of rot, of something foul and putrid rising from beneath the earth. Ben screamed. A horrific snap echoed through the air, followed by the shrill sound of twisting roots. The forest was closing in on them. John had no choice. He pulled his son close to him, holding him in his arms as the ground cracked open beneath them, swallowing the dirt, the rocks, and everything else around them. The thing, the creature, was in the earth now. It was no longer confined to the trees, no longer bound to the land. It was the land. John's mind whirled. The realization struck him with a brutal clarity. The forest, the trees, the earth beneath them, it all had to be destroyed. The forest's hunger had been unleashed. And if they were to survive, if they were to escape this place alive, they would have to destroy what they had disturbed. They would have to sever the connection to the land itself, and there was only one way to do it. There was no choice. The metal detector. The device that had first unearthed the locket. The thing had been attracted to it, drawn to it. The vibrations, the hum. It had been a signal. But that signal had also been their downfall. And now, it would be their salvation. John turned to Ben, his voice shaking as he said, "We have to destroy it. We have to destroy the detector." The words felt hollow as he said them, like he was offering a helpless prayer. "Do you understand? The metal detector is the key. We have to destroy it." Ben's terrified eyes met his father's, and for the first time since all of this began, John saw a flicker of understanding. Ben didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He simply nodded. And together, father and son turned to face the thing that had now fully emerged from the earth. The roots, the limbs, the twisting tendrils that had once been the trees were moving faster now, too fast. They were closing in, tightening their grip, coiling like snakes. John knew they didn't have much time. They had to destroy the metal detector. They had to sever the bond. But even as he reached for it, the world around him was becoming nothing but shadows, darkness, and an unrelenting force pulling them into the abyss. The thing wasn't just alive, it was growing. And John felt a pang of guilt, of helplessness, as he realized there was only one way to end it all. He had to destroy the source. The world around them was collapsing. The trees, once silent sentinels, had become monstrous, alive with a ferocity that mirrored the creature's hunger. John could feel the air thick with something ancient, something alive, pressing down on them, stifling their every breath. The earth quaked beneath their feet, the forest groaning in pain as the roots and tendrils of the trees twisted upward, snaking their way around them. The metal detector lay in the dirt, half buried in the soil, its lights flickering weakly as if it too was losing its battle with the growing darkness. Its presence had awoken something that had slumbered for centuries, but now it had become a signal, a call, drawing the attention of something far worse than they could have ever imagined. Something that had once ruled this land, a force older than time itself, a force that was now clawing its way to the surface. John's heart raced in his chest as he gripped Ben's arm tighter, his son trembling beside him. Every moment seemed like an eternity as the roots of the trees continued to reach for them, their bark-like fingers scraping against the earth, reaching for their flesh. John couldn't help but think of the creature, the entity that had been bound beneath the ground. It was no longer just a creature. It had become the forest itself, the trees, the dirt, the roots. It was the land, and the land was hungry. Ben's voice was small, barely a whisper, but it cut through the oppressive silence of the forest like a knife. "Dad, are we going to make it out?" John didn't answer at first. He couldn't. He didn't know. He wasn't sure if they had any chance of surviving, not with the forest closing in on them, not with the thing rising from the depths of the earth. His mind raced. Destroy the metal detector. That was the only chance they had. But as his gaze fixed on the broken device, a dark thought gnawed at him. Was it truly the metal detector that had awoken the creature? Or had the forest been waiting all along, silently sensing the disturbance? The more John thought about it, the more it seemed that the metal detector was simply a catalyst. The real horror, the real force, was the land itself. The earth beneath their feet was not just soil and rock. It was a living entity, a god perhaps, an entity that had been waiting for the right moment to rise and reclaim what had been taken from it. The ground trembled again, this time with a low, grinding roar that seemed to shake the very air. The roots beneath them jerked, snapping and cracking like bones being crushed underfoot. And then the forest screamed. A sound so horrific, so primal, it was as though the very fabric of the earth had torn open, unleashing a flood of rage and hunger that could not be contained. The trees shook violently, their trunks snapping and twisting as if trying to free themselves from the grip of some unseen force. The thing, the entity, was feeding on the forest, on the land, on them. John's thoughts snapped back to Ben. He could hear the fear in his son's voice as the boy struggled to breathe. I can't breathe, Dad!" Ben gasped, clutching his chest. John glanced around frantically. The forest had closed in on them completely now. They were standing at the very heart of it, surrounded by the twisted, gnarly roots and dark, thick branches that seemed to pulse with life, as if the trees themselves were watching them, waiting to see what would happen next. There was no way out, no path forward. Only the suffocating darkness and the ever-encroaching nightmare. And then, from the depths of the forest, a voice. It was not a voice made of words. It was a feeling, a deep, rumbling presence that reverberated through John's chest, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. "You cannot escape me." The sound wasn't just in their ears, it was in their minds, in their blood, in their very bones. It wanted them, and John felt an icy dread crawl over him, paralyzing him for a moment. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the thing that had always been here, that had always watched. It was ancient, like a spirit of the earth itself, a god of nature with an insatiable hunger. "You will serve me," the voice continued, its tone a growl that seemed to shake the very leaves in the trees. "You freed me from my prison, and now you will feed me, as the others did before you." John's breath caught in his throat as he realized the true horror of the situation. This wasn't just a creature they had awoken. No, it was something older. It was a god of the earth, of the trees, of the land. It had once been worshipped. It had once been fed. And it had been waiting for centuries, waiting for something or someone to disturb the balance, to wake it from its slumber, so it could reclaim what had been taken from it, and now it was hungry. It was waiting for its next sacrifice. John grabbed Ben's arm tighter, pulling him closer. They had to act now. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The metal detector was their only chance. If it had drawn the entity to them, then perhaps it could be the key to stopping it. But to destroy it, they would have to reach it. They would have to cross through the forest, the very thing that was trying to claim them. Ben, his face pale and streaked with sweat, looked up at his father with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad, please, I'm scared. I don't know what's happening." John swallowed, his throat dry. He had no answers for his son. No comfort. No way to explain the horror that was unfolding around them. All he could do was try to save Ben, try to save them both. "We have to destroy the detector, Ben," he said, his voice trembling. "We have to destroy the signal. It's the only way." Ben's eyes flickered toward the metal detector, its broken frame half sunken into the earth. The device seemed to pulse with a faint glow, as if it was somehow alive, feeding the darkness. And yet, even in its broken state, it was still working, still calling to the creature, to the forest. The thing was feeding on the signal, but how? How could they destroy something that was so deeply connected to the very land they stood on? The earth trembled again, sending another shockwave of fear through John's body. The trees around them swayed, their branches creaking like old bones. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the voice, that voice, came again, louder now, as if the creature were growing more impatient. "You will feed me," it hissed. "I will take you. I will take you and your son. And when I am done, the forest will have claimed everything, everything, and everyone." The roots were almost upon them now. They twisted, they jerked, they slithered toward them like the fingers of some enormous hand, closing in, tightening around their legs, their arms, their necks. There was no time left. John didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the metal detector from the ground, holding it high above his head. The device seemed to hum with life, the air crackling with static as the very ground beneath him groaned, protesting the motion. It felt like the forest was fighting him, pulling at his limbs, trying to drag him back into the earth. But John didn't care anymore. He didn't care if it killed him. He just wanted to save Ben. With a primal scream, he slammed the metal detector into the ground with all his strength. The earth shook violently, the very air around them warping as if time itself were bending. The ground cracked wide open, and for a moment, John saw it, the heart of the forest pulsing beneath the earth, a dark, twisted core that throbbed with an ancient energy. The world stopped. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. No roots, no trees, no forest, just darkness. Then, the ground buckled beneath them, and everything was swallowed whole. Everything went dark. The world as John knew it was gone. The trees, the sounds of the forest, the suffocating air, it all vanished in an instant, swallowed by the earth as if the very land itself had turned against them. The deafening silence that followed was unnerving, a stillness that felt too heavy, too thick, as if time had been frozen, suspended in the void. John's heart thudded in his chest, louder than ever before. But even that sound seemed to disappear into the endless blackness that surrounded him. He couldn't feel the ground beneath him anymore. There was no air, no wind, only a kind of pressure. The weight of something vast, something cosmic bearing down on him, as though the very fabric of reality had changed. It felt as though he and Ben were drifting in space, suspended between worlds, but still, some part of John felt the raw, primal need to survive. He had to keep moving. He had to protect Ben. "Ben," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence. His breath seemed muffled, as though it was caught in his throat. "Ben, are you here?" A faint cough echoed in the darkness, and then a soft, trembling voice. "Dad! Dad, I can't see. I can't breathe." John reached out, his hands outstretched, but he couldn't feel anything, couldn't sense anything beyond the overwhelming weight of the air pressing in on him. A terrible sinking feeling filled his stomach. Had they fallen into some kind of void? He felt something, just the slightest shift, beneath his feet. Slowly, cautiously, he forced his body to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. The pressure was unbearable, but he wasn't going to collapse. Not yet. Not with Ben so close. "Ben, hold on to me. Stay close." John's voice was hoarse, desperate, but it was the only thing that anchored him to reality in the pitch blackness. Ben's hand found his, cold and shaking, but there was no sense of solidity. It was as if the air itself was soft, an impossible thing to hold on to. The ground beneath their feet was moving, shifting, and John fought the rising panic, forcing himself to breathe. He had no idea where they were or what had happened, but something told him they were no longer on the surface of the earth. They had gone deeper, much deeper. Somehow, through the weight of the darkness, through the pressure that gnawed at his chest, John became aware of a faint pulse, a throb that seemed to emanate from all around them. It was distant at first, like the beating of a heart, and then it grew louder, closer, an ominous, rhythmical thumping that matched the pounding of his own pulse. It was as though the earth itself was alive, alive with some malevolent, ancient force that was now gathering its strength. Suddenly, the ground shifted again, and a cold gust of air rushed past them, carrying with it a pungent odor, something sour, rancid, like rotting flesh. John coughed, gagged, the taste of it sickening him, but before he could even react, a terrible noise split the air, a sound like nails on chalkboard, a screeching, scratching, twisting noise that came from beneath them. And then, something moved. John felt it first. A cold, wet slither brushing against his leg, like something alive, something crawling. His heart stopped. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat as he looked down into the suffocating darkness. Something was down there. The noise came again, louder this time. Something ancient, something hungry. It was the earth. The force beneath them was shifting, reshaping itself. And John realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity, they weren't just beneath the surface of the earth. They were inside it, in the heart of whatever evil had been awakened. The metal detector's pulse had acted as a beacon, an invitation. And now, whatever lived in the dark bowels of the earth had come for them. "Dad, it's everywhere." Ben's voice was filled with panic, his small hands clutching tighter to John's arm, but it was no use. The darkness was all around them, swallowing them whole, pressing them down. John tried to force the image of what might be crawling toward them from his mind, but the smell, the cold, slithering sensation, was unbearable. He had no choice now but to move forward. The pulse grew louder, and now it was accompanied by a vibration, a tremor running through the very earth itself. It was as if the entire world was alive, breathing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the entity, the thing that had risen from the forest. Every time the pulse throbbed, the darkness seemed to stretch, to swell. It was not just the trees that had been tainted. The entire earth had become infected by the creature's presence. "Ben," John breathed, forcing himself to speak through the sickening terror that rose in his throat. "We need to move. Stay with me." They started walking, each step a slow, deliberate motion, as if the ground itself wanted to swallow them up. Every footfall felt like an eternity, as though the earth was waiting to swallow them whole, to drag them deeper into its suffocating blackness. And still, that pulse, a heartbeat, rhythmic, inevitable, continued to throb, like a drum beating in the distance, guiding them toward whatever was waiting. It felt like hours or maybe days had passed since they had fallen, but in the end it didn't matter. The air grew colder with every step they took. The pressure tightened, and still the pulse called to them, louder, more insistent. It was as if the entity was beckoning them deeper, coaxing them toward its dark heart, toward the source of its power. Suddenly, the pulse stopped. The silence was worse than anything. John froze, listening. His mind raced. What did this mean? And then, as if in answer, a low, guttural rumble shook the very ground beneath their feet. A deep, resonating voice, like the earth itself speaking, slithered through the darkness. "You cannot run from me. You are already mine." The words sank into John's chest, ice cold, like daggers of fear stabbing deep into his heart. His breath came in sharp gasps. He could feel it. The creature, the thing, that entity that had once been the forest, was closing in on them. The darkness around them seemed to pulse, as if alive, like a mass of roots, creeping, twisting, curling, toward them. John's mind raced. The metal detector, he had to destroy it, he had to stop the signal. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. The creature had already claimed them. The forest had already claimed them, and now it was time for them to pay. A sound, a creaking, cracking sound came from above them, and John's heart nearly stopped. He looked up. The walls of the cavern, if it could even be called that, were shifting. The stone began to crack, and the pulse, the heartbeat, was no longer just a sound. It was the very earth itself, moving, closing in on them. And then, from the darkness, something moved, a tendril, a root. Long and thin, like the finger of some colossal ancient being, it shot toward them with lightning speed, wrapping around John's wrist, dragging him toward the earth itself. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the shifting, creaking ground. "Dad, no, no!" Ben's voice broke through the chaos. John's vision blurred as the root tightened, pulling him deeper, the earth swallowing him whole. He looked at his son one last time and saw the terror in Ben's eyes. The boy was reaching for him, but there was nothing he could do. And then, nothing but darkness. The crushing weight of the earth pressed down on John, suffocating him, as if the land itself had become his tomb. But impossibly, the darkness shifted. There was a flicker of light, a pinprick of hope, like a distant star, flickering faintly. In the deep, endless void, his body was still trapped, pulled by some malevolent force into the very bowels of the earth. But his mind had not yet surrendered to the abyss. Where am I? The question echoed over and over again in his mind, but no answer came. The air was thick and stale, like centuries of dust had settled here, untouched by time. Beneath him, the ground quaked once again, but this time the tremor felt different, familiar. And then the heartbeat. The pulse, that low, throbbing rhythm was there again, vibrating through the very bones of the earth, resonating in his chest. It was stronger now, more present, like it had been awakened from some deep, primordial slumber. "Ben." John whispered hoarsely, but his voice felt weak, frail in the suffocating dark. There was no response, no echo of his son's voice. The silence was deafening. His heart skipped a beat. Had Ben been taken? Had the thing already claimed him? Panic surged in John's chest like a cold wave, drowning him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. "Ben is alive," he told himself, gritting his teeth. "He has to be." With a strained breath, John tried to pull himself up, to fight against the force that held him captive, but the root, no, the tendril, was wrapped around him like a vice. It felt alive, the rough bark-like surface shifting and squirming beneath his skin, cold and clammy. It wasn't just a root. It was part of the thing, part of the ancient force that had awakened when the metal detector had broken the seal. As John struggled, his thoughts flickered to the night they had first arrived in the forest. How small the world had seemed then. How innocent. He had no idea then how close they were to something so much darker, so much more terrible. Something that had been waiting for centuries. The pulse was the heartbeat of the entity, and that entity had been sleeping, waiting beneath the earth, buried deep beneath the roots of the ancient trees. The earth trembled again. John's eyes snapped open, and it was then that he saw them. Eyes, dozens of them glowing faintly like embers, watching him from the dark corners of the cavern. They were not human eyes. No, they were the eyes of something other, something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. A shiver ran through his spine as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Were they creatures? Spirits? The air grew colder. One of the eyes blinked slowly, and John's heart nearly stopped. The pulse in his chest matched the rhythm of the heartbeat again, almost like an answer. The darkness felt alive, pressing down on him from all sides, suffocating him, closing in like a vice. Then, with a deafening crack, the walls of the cavern, no, not a cavern, a tomb, shifted, as if something vast, ancient, and hungry was, stirring deep within the earth. The pulse grew stronger, louder. John could feel the vibrations in his bones, rattling him to his core. It was as though the very heartbeat of the earth was pushing against him, pulling him toward it, forcing him into the heart of the thing's power. "Ben!" John cried out, struggling against the tendril that held him. His hands were slick with sweat, his body trembling with exhaustion, but still, the grip of the root wouldn't loosen. The heartbeat thudded louder. The eyes blinked, one by one, as if they were aware, watching, waiting. In a panic, John jerked his body violently, his fingers scrabbling at the bark of the root that bound him, and then, as if mocking his efforts, the ground beneath him cracked open, sending a shockwave of pain through his body as the tendrils tightened. And then, the voice. It wasn't the voice of a man, or a woman, or even a creature. No, it was something far deeper, far older. A voice made of earth, made of roots and soil and leaves. A whisper that came from within the bones of the world itself. "You freed me." John's heart skipped a beat. The words came from everywhere, filling his mind. His chest, his very soul. It was like the earth was breathing the words into his mind. "And now, you will serve." John's pulse quickened, and his breath grew shallow as the gravity of the words pressed down on him. Serve. He fought against the tendril again, the pressure intensifying as the earth around him groaned in response. The forest, the land, they are mine, and you are mine now. Suddenly, the darkness moved. It rippled like a shadow made of smoke, and for a fleeting moment, John saw something. A face, a twisted, horrific thing, an ancient mask of bark and bone, eyes wide and unblinking. Its gaze pierced him, reaching inside his mind, as though it could see the very core of his being. The creature had been the earth itself, the forest. But now it had risen. It had become something more. The tendril loosened, and John fell to his knees, gasping for air, his body aching, his vision spinning. But the earth did not release him. The pressure, the throb, the pulse, it was still there, a constant weight pressing against him. He looked down at the root that had bound him, only to realize it had changed. The bark had split open, revealing something inside, something writhing, twisting, alive. The ground trembled beneath him, the pulse growing stronger. "Ben!" John gasped again, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper as his eyes scanned. the inky blackness, desperate to find his son. But all around him the darkness seemed to stretch infinitely, as though there was no escape from the all-consuming weight of the earth. It was closing in on him. Something moved near him. A shift. In the shadows like the rustle of leaves, John turned, but before he could see clearly, something caught his leg, and he was dragged further into the dark. The light, the faint, flickering light from the distant flicker of the eyes, flickered out. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the heartbeat returned, but this time it was closer, and this time it wasn't alone. John's chest tightened, his breath rattling in his throat, as the pulse of the earth surged around him like a relentless tide. It wasn't just a heartbeat anymore. It was the rhythm of something alive, something vast and ancient, echoing from deep beneath the world's surface. The pulse reverberated through his body, through his very soul. The air itself seemed to throb with it, as if the entire world were alive, an organism, breathing, pulsating with malevolent intent. The tendrils, roots of some ancient being, wrapped tighter around him, dragging him deeper into the abyss. But John didn't care. In his mind there was only one thing, one person. Ben. His son was out there, somewhere, lost. And the terror that filled John's chest wasn't the terror of death, but the terror of losing the only person he had left in this world. The only thing that still tethered him to what was human. But the longer he struggled, the more he could feel the earth drawing him in like an inevitable force that knew no mercy, no compassion. Ben, he screamed, his voice raw and hoarse. The words were swallowed by the darkness. But still, he called out, desperate. His heart raced as he fought against the crushing weight that had closed in on him. He could feel the earth shifting around, him, its very shape folding in on itself, reshaping the cavern, reshaping the world itself. The pulse was louder now, as if whatever was waiting below the surface had taken notice of his resistance. It was as though the earth itself was trying to consume him, to break him apart, piece by piece. The heartbeat quickened, and then a shift, a soft rustle, a distant voice. Dad. It wasn't the voice John had been expecting. It wasn't Ben's voice. Not exactly. It was familiar but wrong, twisted, echoed. John's heart stuttered in his chest. Ben? His voice cracked as he called out again, but the answer that came was a low, guttural growl, almost a snarl. No, Dad. The voice spoke again, but this time the words felt off, like a distorted reflection of Ben's voice. Something bent, something unnatural. You shouldn't have come. John's eyes went wide. He reached out blindly, trying to move toward the sound, but the darkness was so thick, so suffocating. He could feel the pulse of the earth reverberating through his, skull thrumming in time with his own heartbeat. No, John whispered. His mind was spinning. The words didn't make sense. What was happening? Suddenly the ground quaked again, harder this time, as if a massive force was pushing its way through the earth. A blinding light flared from beneath him, a burst of searing white that filled the cavern with an otherworldly glow, casting the twisted shadows of roots and bones on the walls. And then the face appeared. It wasn't just a face. It was a mask, an ancient thing, composed of intertwined roots, bark, and bone, a grotesque, monstrous thing with eyes like burning coals. Its mouth opened wide, a cavernous maw that seemed to stretch for miles. A voice, like the rumbling of thunder, echoed from within. You have awakened me, mortal. John's body trembled as the voice pierced through him, shaking the very core of his being. The creature's eyes locked onto him with an unblinking stare, its gaze both terrifying and all-knowing. It was not just a forest spirit or a creature of legend. This thing was the forest, the land itself, but now it had transcended that, It was something more, something monstrous, something ancient. "You think you can stop me?" The creature's voice reverberated in the air, a cacophony of whispers that made John's skin crawl. "You are nothing but a trespasser. You do not belong here, neither do your kind." John could feel the pull of the earth, the weight of centuries of suffering and rage bearing down on him. It was as if the very soil was alive, alive with hate, with vengeance. The land had been waiting for centuries, dormant. But now it was waking, and John and Ben were at its mercy. "But I will not let you take him." The thought struck John like a bolt of lightning. The fire within him flared with the only thing left in him now: resolve. "No," he said hoarsely, but with more force. "I will stop you." He was shaking, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his mind was clear. He couldn't let this thing consume his son, consume the world, not after everything they had already endured. He had no idea how, but he would find a way to stop it. The creature's laugh rumbled in the air. "You think you can stop me? You are already mine." Suddenly, the ground beneath John cracked open, a massive chasm splitting the earth. From the depths below, the creature's tendrils shot up like serpents, wrapping around his body, squeezing tighter. It wasn't just the earth anymore. It was alive. It was part of the creature. The creature was the land, and the land was the creature. John fought against it with every ounce of strength he had left. His vision blurred. His breath came in short, painful gasps. Ben. He had to reach Ben. "Ben!" He screamed once more, his voice cracking, and then, through the tumult, through the chaos and the rising tension, something happened, a flicker of light. A figure emerged from the shadows, someone or something moving in the dark. The figure was tall, thin, and unnaturally pale, like a spectre. A face, Ben's face, stared back at him. But it was wrong. The eyes were empty, hollow, like windows, to a soul, lost to time. "Ben?" John's voice was barely a whisper. His heart pounded in his chest, and he reached out, desperate to make sense of what he was seeing. But Ben didn't answer. He just stood there, eyes fixed on John, his face expressionless. And then, slowly, his lips parted, and he spoke the words that would haunt John forever. "You shouldn't have come." The world around them shook. The heartbeat was now deafening, a pounding rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundation of existence. The earth cracked open wider, the tendrils reaching, writhing, and then everything went still. The silence was suffocating. The pulse stopped, and in that silence, John heard it, the final horrifying truth. Ben was no longer his son. He was the creature's vessel. He was part of the earth, part of the ancient twisted force that had awakened. John's desperate cries had only called it to him, had only led it to consume everything he loved. As John's eyes filled with tears, the ground beneath him opened once more, the light fading into shadow, and the last thing he saw was the face, the eyes, of what had once been his son. The darkness swallowed him whole, and thus the forest grew darker, the earth sinking deeper into the depths of a malevolent force that would never again be silenced. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Hunter's boots crunched over the frost-covered earth as he trekked deeper into the Tongass National Forest. The trees, ancient and gnarled, loomed like silent sentinels, their towering shadows stretching across the narrow trail. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the faint trace of wood smoke that had lingered from the previous night's fire. He had barely spoken to anyone in days, and the isolation gnawed at him, a biting reminder of why he had come here in the first place. The thrill of survival, the challenge to prove himself, not just to his viewers, but to himself. Yet beneath the excitement, a creeping unease gnawed at his gut. It wasn't the wilderness itself. Hunter had faced tougher terrain, endured harsher climates, and survived in more unforgiving conditions. No, it was something else. Something subtle. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was the silence. The kind of silence that feels thick, like a weight pressing down on your chest. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud. As Hunter made his way deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the wind biting at his exposed skin. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath, his camera rolling as he took in the surroundings, narrating his thoughts aloud for his viewers. All right, guys, this is it. Tongass National Forest, the largest temperate rainforest in the world. We're going to be out here for at least a week, roughing it in the wild, all by myself. He paused, the words feeling hollow even as they left his lips. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. Hunter adjusted the strap of his backpack, casting a glance over his shoulder at the trail he had just left behind. It was barely visible now, swallowed by the thick woods. The eerie quiet seemed to deepen the farther he went, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But no animals appeared, no squirrels, no birds flitted through the branches, no rustling underfoot. It was almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. His mind wandered, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was making a mistake. People who came to places like this often had stories of strange happenings, mysterious noises at night, things moving when no one was around. Ghosts of the forest, they called them. Hunters and campers who had vanished without a trace. Of course, he'd never believed any of that. Not until now. With a deep breath, he shook the thought away, convinced he was just getting nervous. It's just the isolation, he told himself. You're here to survive, not to let your mind get the best of you. He finally arrived at a small clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was soft here, a mixture of moss and dry leaves with towering pines forming a natural barrier from the wind. Hunter began unloading his gear, setting up his tent and preparing a fire pit. As he worked, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a sound just on the edge of perception. For a moment, he thought he heard someone call his name, but when he turned, there was no one in sight. You're imagining things, he chastised himself, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Nightfall came. Quickly in the forest, and with it, the temperature dropped sharply. Hunter sat by the fire, the flames crackling and popping as he watched the shadows stretch across the ground. He was alone, yet the emptiness around him seemed too perfect. The firelight flickered, throwing long, crooked shapes against the trees, distorting the forest into something unrecognizable. The first night passed without incident, the only sounds those of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. Hunter tried to sleep, but the isolation gnawed at him, keeping him restless. His mind raced with thoughts of home, of his life outside this wilderness, his subscribers, his content, his failed relationships. All of it swirled together in the dark silence, the pressure of it heavy on his chest. At some point, exhaustion won out, and he finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. When he woke the next morning, the forest felt different. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the cool mist that clung to the ground made the air seem thicker, more oppressive. He rubbed his eyes, stifling a yawn, and unzipped the tent. As he stepped outside, the early light illuminated the clearing, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. Hunter paused. The camp looked untouched, but something felt off. His eyes scanned the area, his breath hanging in the cold air. The fire pit was still there, a small ring of stones where he had left it the night before. But as he moved closer, his eyes narrowed. There was something odd about the fire pit. It looked different. The ashes had been disturbed. The stones were slightly out of place. And, most concerning of all, there was a small patch of ground that looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had been here, someone other than him. Hunter frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. He crouched down, inspecting the ground. There were no footprints, but the disturbance was there, small, subtle but unmistakable. His heart started to race, a dull thud in his chest, as a suspicion crept into his mind. He had been alone, hadn't he? He hadn't heard anyone else approach, and yet someone had been here. He stood up quickly, scanning the area, his breath coming faster now. The trees were thick and the shadows deep, but there was no sign of movement, no sound. As he walked back to his gear, he noticed something else. His food bags, his stove, his cooking gear, they had been moved. Not a lot, but just enough to be unsettling. His water bottle, which had been sitting next to his backpack, was now several feet away. It was almost like someone had come in during the night, moved things around, and then vanished. The wind. He forced the thought from his mind. There was no way the wind had moved his gear that far. Something wasn't right. He grabbed his camera bag, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled to pull out his phone. His fingers felt stiff, cold, like they weren't entirely his own. He began recording, speaking to his audience, trying to calm himself. Okay, guys, this is weird. I'm not sure what's going on, but it looks like someone's been messing with my stuff. No signs of animals, nothing, just these small, subtle changes. I don't know if I'm just freaking out or if something else is going on here, but this isn't normal. I'll keep you updated. He ended the recording and slipped the camera back into his bag, his gaze still fixed on the ground where his supplies had been moved. He walked around the camp, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, but with every step, the feeling only intensified. The forest around him felt heavy now, as though the trees themselves were watching. The silence had deepened, and for the first time Hunter felt truly alone. The thought clung to him like a shadow, the sensation of being watched, of something or someone lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until he turned back toward the tent that he noticed the first set of footprints. Barefoot, small, delicate, footprints that circled the base of his tent in erratic patterns. The prints were fresh, barely leaving an impression on the frost beneath them. They were so tiny they couldn't possibly belong to him. Hunter's stomach churned. He knelt, inspecting the tracks, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of struggle, no sign of a scuffle, just footprints. And then, as though to confirm his worst fear, the temperature seemed to drop further, the wind picking up with an unnatural force. He stood up suddenly, the urge to leave the camp gnawing at him, but something stopped him. Something told him to stay, to keep moving forward. The thought of running felt like a trap. That's when he heard it, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the trees, his breath caught in his throat. Hunter. The air was stifling now, thick with an oppressive humidity that seemed to cling to Hunter's skin despite the cold. He froze, the whisper still echoing in his mind like a distant memory. It was the kind of sound you might hear when you're half dreaming, the kind of thing that feels like it could just be a trick of the wind, a trick of your tired brain. But Hunter had been awake for hours. He wasn't imagining it. He turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the trees, trying to locate the source of that voice. A branch creaked in the wind, but there was no one, no movement, no signs of life. Only shadows and the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze. His heartbeat quickened, the cold air seeming to freeze around him. Hello? His voice cracked slightly as it broke the silence, sounding thin and fragile against the immensity of the forest. He listened closely for a response, but the only thing he heard was the sound of his own ragged breath. The whisper. It wasn't real. He had to convince himself of that. He had to stay calm. It's just the isolation, he told himself. You're just hearing things, the wind, the trees. You've been out here too long. Your mind is starting to play tricks. Hunter took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. But the unease lingered in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him. Something was wrong. He couldn't ignore it. He wasn't just hearing things. He turned back to the tent, his gaze darting over the ground where the footprints had been, still visible in the frost. They weren't just there. They had circled around the tent, the steps so precise, so deliberate, as if someone had been observing him while he slept. His throat tightened as he crouched down to examine them again, his eyes tracing the edges of the prints, looking for any clues. They were impossibly small, almost childlike, but not quite. Too small to be his own, and too delicate to belong to anyone who would wander barefoot in such a cold and unforgiving environment. He pressed his fingers into the frost around them, but no matter how hard he tried, the edges of the prints wouldn't yield. It was as though they had been left by someone, or something, that didn't need to leave a trace. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the silence settling in around him like a suffocating blanket. The forest had become suffocatingly still, the air stagnant. Not a single bird, not a single animal sound. It was as though the very life of the woods had vanished, leaving only the oppressive hum of the wind. Shaking his head, Hunter rose to his feet and stepped back from the tent. He couldn't stay here any longer, not with this thing, whatever it was, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. He had to do something. He had to figure out what was happening. Hunter moved toward the campfire, the dying embers offering little warmth. The fire had been a comforting presence, but now it seemed hollow, its flames too weak to push back the darkness creeping over the trees. He knelt by the fire pit, poking at the ashes with a stick, trying to banish the cold creeping into his bones. His mind kept returning to that voice, the whisper, Hunter. The wind stirred again, but this time it carried something else with it, a sharp, acrid scent. Something rotting, something wrong. The smell was faint at first, just a whisper in the air, but as Hunter inhaled, it grew stronger, more pungent, cloying, until his stomach churned. It wasn't the smell of nature. It wasn't the smell of the forest. It was something decayed, something unnatural. Hunter jumped to his feet, his pulse racing. The fire crackled, the sound sharp in the otherwise still forest, as though mocking him. This isn't right, he thought, his throat tightening. He scanned the forest again, his eyes darting through the dark shapes of the trees, but there was nothing. The whisper, the footprints, the smell. Nothing made sense. It felt like the world was shifting, slipping through his fingers like sand. Suddenly, his eyes caught something, movement, just on the edge of the clearing between the trees. A shadow, a figure. For a split second he thought it was just another trick of the light, the flames casting an illusion, but then the figure shifted again, slowly, purposefully. Hunter's breath caught in his throat as he stood, frozen, staring, into the dark. The figure didn't move like an animal, didn't dart through the shadows like a person trying to remain hidden. No, it stood there, still and unmoving, just beyond the reach of the fire's light, as though waiting for something. He blinked rapidly, his heart pounding against his ribs. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but the longer he stared, the more it felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Hunter swallowed, the taste of fear sharp in his mouth, and instinctively reached for his camera. Is someone there? His voice trembled, barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. He clicked on the camera, his hands shaking as he began to record. "Guys," he said, his voice strained. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not alone here. He stopped mid-sentence as the figure finally shifted again, this time taking a single slow step forward. The camera in his hand trembled as he raised it toward the figure. But just before the lens could focus, the shadow darted away, vanishing into the trees with a speed that left Hunter breathless. His heart pounded violently in his chest, the cold sweat beading on his forehead. "Hello?" he called again, his voice now barely more than a croak. "Who's out there?" There was no answer, only the sound of his own breath, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional distant rustle in the trees. Hunter's mind raced. Was it an animal? No. He was sure now. Whatever it wasn't an animal. This was something else. Something that didn't belong in the forest, something that shouldn't have been here. His heart raced as his eyes darted around, his senses straining to pick up any movement. But the figure was gone, vanished. He stumbled backward, his legs unsteady, his breath ragged. The smell of rot lingered in the air, mingling with the fresh scent of pine. The sense of being watched grew stronger, more palpable, until it felt like the very trees themselves were leaning in, listening, waiting. With trembling hands, Hunter turned to his trail camera, his last hope of capturing whatever this was. He took the footage card out of the camera and rushed to his laptop, plugging it in with frantic urgency. The screen flickered to life, and he scrolled through the footage, expecting to see an animal, a bear, or some other creature. But when the footage loaded, his stomach lurched. There, just outside the firelight, stood the figure once again, blurry, indistinct, like smoke caught in the glow of a flame. But now it was closer. Much closer. It was almost as if it had moved between frames, materializing in places it had not been before. He could just make out the shape of it. Tall, thin, but the most unsettling thing was its posture. The way it bent unnaturally, as if the joints in its body were wrong, twisted, deformed. The figure didn't move in a typical way. It hovered like it was standing just outside of time. Its presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like something that had always been there, waiting, watching. Hunter's breath caught in his throat as the figure in the footage tilted its head, almost like it was studying him. The screen flickered again, and in the final frames, just before the camera cut off, Hunter saw something that made his blood run cold. In the background, behind the figure, was another shadow, a taller, more distorted shape, looming over the first, its form stretching unnaturally, as though it had no real shape at all. Hunter turned away from the laptop, his stomach twisting into a knot. He didn't want to believe what he had just seen, but he had no choice. The forest had answered him, and the answer was one he wasn't ready for. Hunter couldn't breathe. His mind reeled, replaying the footage over and over again. Those blurred, distorted figures, the way they seemed to shift, to move between frames. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in this world. The cold from the forest seemed to seep into his bones. And for the first time since he arrived, the wilderness didn't feel like a challenge. It didn't feel like something he could conquer. It felt like a trap that had been waiting for him long before he ever set foot in the Tongass. The strange, hollow feeling that had settled in his chest began to spread, like a cold fog, creeping through his limbs. His hand trembled as he closed the laptop, the soft click of it snapping shut too loud in the stillness. The air in the tent was too heavy, too thick, and his throat tightened, as if the forest itself was closing in around him. "Now get a grip," he told himself. "It's just a trick of the light, bad footage. It's nothing." But deep down, he knew better. That voice, the whisper, the shadow, they weren't coincidences. They weren't just his mind playing tricks. They were warnings, warnings that had been waiting for him. The air outside felt oppressive, as though the very trees were watching him, listening. The whisper had been so faint, so fleeting, but now the memory of it clung to him like a shadow, growing stronger, more persistent. Hunter. The voice came again, louder this time. It didn't sound like the wind. It didn't sound like anything natural. It sounded like a command, a summons. Hunter snapped to attention, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice hadn't come from the trees. It hadn't come from anywhere outside the tent. It had come from within. His mouth went dry. He had been so focused on the shadow, on the figure in the trees, that he hadn't noticed the strangling presence that had been creeping up behind him. The feeling of something watching him, it wasn't an external threat. It was something else. Something that was with him. Inside his mind, the tent flaps rustled, as if something had brushed against them from the outside. His first instinct was to turn and look, but he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. His breath came in shallow gasps, as though the air itself had thickened, becoming harder to draw into his lungs. His fingers gripped the edge of the tent, the material crinkling beneath his fingertips. He didn't know if it was fear or something else, but the tension was unbearable. It was like the world outside was closing in, tightening around him with every passing second. Hunter. The voice was now unmistakable. It was inside him, in his head. The air seemed to ripple with it, vibrating with its unnatural presence. I can't stay here. He tried to stand up, but his legs refused to cooperate. He was paralyzed by fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. The voice didn't stop. It didn't fade. It pressed in, filling every corner of his mind. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come here. Hunter's chest tightened. It was like the forest had come alive. Like every tree, every leaf, every stone was now part of some dark, malevolent presence, watching him, studying him. He needed to leave. He needed to run. But the moment he moved, the whisper grew louder. The voice seemed to twist, like fingers scraping against the inside of his skull. It's too late. You can't leave. His body finally obeyed, and he stumbled toward the door of the tent, his heart hammering in his chest. He ripped the flap open, gasping as cold air rushed in, slapping his face. The world outside was still shrouded in shadow, the towering trees, now leaning in like dark giants, their branches twisted and skeletal against the dimming sky. The forest was silent again, too silent, and yet the pressure didn't lift. If anything, it intensified. Hunter stood frozen in the doorway of the tent, staring out into the darkness. The fire he had built earlier was nothing more than a pile of smoldering embers now, its glow barely visible against the growing dark. He looked down at his feet, the footprints, the tiny barefoot prints that had circled his tent the night before. They were back. They were larger now, more distinct, and they were closer. The prints trailed away from the tent, leading into the forest, and just beyond them, where the ground was soft and damp, there were new marks, dark smudges like someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. Hunter felt his stomach twist into a knot. The smell of rot lingered in the air, mingling with the cold, the earth, and the sharp tang of pine. It was the same stench he had noticed earlier, the one that had made his stomach churn. But now it was stronger, more pronounced. It was unmistakable. It's real. It's real. Something's out there. Without thinking, Hunter grabbed his flashlight and followed the prints, the beam of light dancing nervously across the ground, illuminating the disturbing trail. The deeper he walked into the woods, the more the silence. pressed in until it felt suffocating. The weight of it was unbearable. The footprints led him to the edge of a small ravine, the ground crumbling beneath his boots as he crept closer. The trees here were sparse, their twisted trunks reaching out like clawed hands. And there, just at the edge of the ravine, was something that made his blood run cold. A second fire pit. It was identical to the one he had made, only it was older. Cracked stones, scorched earth, and remnants of burned wood. But what stopped Hunter in his tracks wasn't the fire pit itself. No, it was what lay next to it, a bundle of human bones. It was as though someone had carefully arranged them, placing them like a sick, twisted offering at the foot of the ravine. The bones were dark, half covered in dirt, but they were unmistakable. The fragile shape of ribs, the curve of a skull, the whitened remains of hands. Hunter stepped back, the flashlight slipping from his hand and tumbling to the ground. It rolled into the darkness, its light spinning wildly before going out entirely. The forest was plunged into an inky blackness. The smell of rot grew stronger. It filled his lungs, thick and suffocating. Hunter's legs trembled beneath him as he stumbled backward, his mind racing with horror. The bones, whose bones were they, and why were they placed here, in the middle of nowhere, in a forest that hadn't seen civilization in decades? The air felt alive now, not in a natural way, but in a way that made his skin crawl, as though the forest was breathing, exhaling its rancid breath into his face. And then, behind him, he heard it. A soft rustling. The sound of something moving through the trees, the scrape of branches against bark, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Hunter spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing but the dark, silent woods, the shadows, and the whisper, louder now, almost suffocating in its intensity. You shouldn't have come. You will never leave. Hunter could feel his pulse racing in his throat. His legs shook beneath him, but his feet refused to move. He stood at the edge of the ravine, staring at the bones, the unmistakable human remains that had appeared out of nowhere. His eyes darted across the ground, looking for some explanation, some sign of why they were there. But there was nothing. Nothing but the deathly silence that wrapped around him like a tightening noose. This isn't real, he thought, trying to convince himself. This is just a trick, some prank. Someone's messing with me. But as the words echoed in his mind, they sounded hollow, even to him. This wasn't a prank. He knew that. He could feel it, the weight of the forest pressing in on him, suffocating him. Like the air itself had turned hostile. It wasn't the wind that made his skin crawl. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting. The whisper came again, cutting through the silence like a knife. Hunter, you're still here. Hunter snapped his head toward the sound, his eyes wide and frantic. He didn't know where it was coming from. It didn't matter. He couldn't hear it and think at the same time. It was like the voice had slipped inside his skull, burrowing deep under his skin. His breath hitched. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that he hadn't been alone since he first set foot in this cursed forest. The smell of decay, damp earth, rotting flesh, was so thick now it felt like it was crawling into his mouth, coating his tongue, gagging him with its rancid sweetness. He stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving way beneath him as his eyes locked onto the human bones again. They weren't just bones. They were a message, a warning. The wind picked up then, swirling through the trees with a sudden violent gust, rattling the branches above him. The trees groaned, their trunks bending in unnatural angles, as though reaching out to grab him. His flashlight lay abandoned on the ground, its beam now lost to the darkness. All that remained was the haunting echo of the voice and the unnatural stillness. The rustling came again, this time closer. It's closer, Hunter's heart pounded so loudly in his ears he could barely think straight. He instinctively reached for his camera, desperate to record this, to prove to himself, to anyone, that this was real, that something out here had been watching him, following him, from the very moment he'd arrived. As his fingers fumbled for the camera, a sudden movement caught his eye. Something shifted in the corner of his vision, just at the edge of the trees. For a brief moment, it looked like a shadow, a figure moving just beyond the reach of his sight. His heart lurched in his chest. Hunter turned, squinting into the dark, trying to make sense of what he had seen. There, again, in the trees. Someone was there. But this time it wasn't a shadow, it was clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless among the trees. Its shape was skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, bent in strange angles that no human body could replicate. Hunter's throat went dry. The figure was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was pale, stretched thin over its bones, and its eyes, those eyes, were empty. Hollow sockets that seemed to draw the very light from the air around it. It was like it was made of shadows, a thing that shouldn't exist, and yet, there it was, watching him. It's not real, he thought again, but this time, the words felt more desperate, less convincing. He knew it was real, and he knew, deep down, that if he didn't leave now, he might not leave at all. Hunter stumbled backward, his eyes never leaving the figure. But as his foot met the edge of the ravine, the ground gave way beneath him. For a moment, he was weightless, suspended in time, and then the earth beneath him crumbled, sending him tumbling down into the darkness. Fee wind howled around him, the trees seeming to reach for him as he fell. His body crashed against rocks, his limbs scraping against jagged edges, the world spinning in a blur of pain and cold. The forest roared in his ears, the whispers louder. Now, a chorus of voices melding into one, filling his mind with their cold, insistent presence. He hit the ground with a sickening thud. His vision swam as he tried to push himself up, the earth soft and wet beneath him, but his body refused to cooperate. Blood dripped from his forehead where a rock had struck him, and his limbs felt heavy, disconnected, like they didn't belong to him anymore. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle, the stench of decay overwhelming. The whispers had stopped. That's worse, Hunter realized, his chest tightening. When the voice stopped, when everything went silent, it was the calm before the storm. It meant something was coming. Something worse than he could have imagined. Hunter scrambled to his feet, his hands slick with blood, his fingers fumbling to find any sort of grip on the wet rocks around him. His heart hammered in his chest, the fear now gnawing at his insides, urging him to run. But there was nowhere to run. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of movement, something dragging its feet along the ground. Slowly, methodically, the ground beneath him vibrated with each step, like a tremor in the earth. His blood froze in his veins. A shape moved through the trees. A tall, impossibly thin figure, hunched and twisted. It wasn't the same figure as before. No, this one was different. It moved with purpose, dragging its limbs behind it like they were broken, mangled, pieces of something that had once been human. And in its wake, it left behind a trail of writhing black tendrils, like veins stretched thin, pulsing with some dark energy. They clung to the ground, twisting into the air, moving toward him with an unnatural, disturbing rhythm. The tendrils slithered and coiled as though they were alive, feeding on the very earth itself. Hunter couldn't breathe. His body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what he was witnessing. It's here. The figure stepped into the faint light from the dying fire pit, and Hunter saw its face. If it could be called a face, it was a mask of twisted flesh. Half rotted, the skin stretched tight over bone. Its mouth was open, wide, impossibly wide, as though its jaw had been dislocated and forced to stay that way. But the most horrifying thing wasn't the grotesque distortion, it was the eyes, empty, hollow. And yet they seemed to see him. They were eyes that had not seen the world for decades, but they saw him now, drawing him in with their dark voids, pulling him closer, closer to the thing behind it, the thing that was waiting for him. Hunter felt the ground shift beneath him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He tried to move, to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His feet were stuck in place as though something was holding him there, keeping him tethered to the earth. And then he understood. The forest wasn't just alive. It wasn't just watching him. The forest was the thing, the entity. It had always been here, and it had been waiting. Hunter's chest heaved in frantic, shallow gasps as he staggered backward, his eyes fixed on the monstrous figure that now stood before him. His mind was a blur, too many thoughts, too much terror. But one clear, undeniable truth had burrowed its way deep into his psyche. The forest was no longer just a place. It was alive. It was sentient. And it wanted him. The figure, a twisted mockery of a human form, stepped closer, its limbs unnaturally long, dragging itself through the underbrush, as if the forest itself was feeding it, binding it to this place. The tendrils, those sickening dark veins, slithered along the forest floor, moving toward Hunter with an insidious hunger. It was alive. It was the forest, in its purest, most malevolent form. And it had been waiting for him. For someone. For anyone foolish enough to venture deep enough into its heart. Hunter's heart raced, his blood thundering in his ears. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to flee as fast as he could, but his legs wouldn't move, his body wouldn't obey. It felt as if the ground itself had gripped him in its cold, unforgiving grasp, trapping him here. The thing, the entity, was so close now, its grotesque figure looming in front of him like a nightmare made flesh. Its face, if it could be called that, was a contorted mask of raw, decaying skin, stretched tight over a jagged skull. Where its eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow sockets, empty black pits that seemed to reach into him, stripping away his thoughts, his will, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. The stench of rot, of decay, churned in his stomach, nearly making him vomit. It was a smell that clung to his skin, soaked into his clothes, a mark of the forest's corruption. And the whisper, the voice. It was louder now, impossibly louder, as though it had grown into a chorus, a cacophony of voices all chanting his name in a terrible, distorted harmony. Hunter, it was like a drumbeat, each whisper louder, deeper, darker than the last. Hunter, you should have left. And then, all at once, the whisper stopped. The forest was silent. Hunter felt the sudden weight of that silence crush him, pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. He didn't know where to look. He didn't know where to move. It was like the world itself had frozen in place by the creature in front of him. The air had thickened, becoming viscous, almost impossible to breathe. And then, just as quickly, the silence was shattered. A crack, sharp and sickening, echoed through the trees like the snapping of bones. And Hunter felt it. Felt the sound, deep in his bones. The ground trembled underfoot, the air rippling with the same malicious energy that had been pulsing through the forest since he arrived. And that's when it happened. The creature moved. Its limbs twitched, jerking unnaturally, as though it was pulling itself free from the very earth, from the trees that had birthed it. It was alive, truly alive now, and the tendrils that had once slithered at its feet began to writhe in the air, stretching out toward Hunter like reaching fingers. He had no choice. His legs screamed at him to run, and finally, they obeyed. His feet pushed him forward, stumbling, his breath ragged and desperate. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move, had to get away from that thing. His body felt like lead as he pushed through the thick underbrush, his mind fighting to stay focused. He had to think, had to remember. What was this place? What was that thing? The bones, the remains, the second fire pit. The thing that had called to him, the thing that had been waiting. Hunter's mind snapped back to the footage, the blurred figure from his trail camera. It was no longer a trick of the light. That shadow, that was it. That was the thing. The mole. Forest had taken form, become real in a way he hadn't yet understood. He could hear it now, the thing behind him, its slithering tendrils scraping against the leaves and branches. The sound of its breath, heavy and deep, reverberated through the trees. It was chasing him. No, it wasn't chasing him. It was herding him, driving him deeper into the heart of the forest, where it knew he couldn't escape. Hunter's legs buckled, and he hit the ground hard. His flashlight, still clutched in his hand, flew from his grip, spinning wildly through the dark before it landed and flickered out. The darkness around him was absolute now, impenetrable. He scrambled to his feet again, but before he could make another move, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. Something was breathing, heavy, labored, a deep, wet inhale that seemed to come from all around him. It was no longer just the forest. It was the entity, its presence growing stronger, pressing in on him from all sides, suffocating him, and then Hunter saw it. Through the inky blackness, a shape, tall, twisted, and alive, loomed before him, blocking his path. It was the creature. The thing he had seen earlier, its grotesque limbs reaching out like long, gnarled branches. But this time, there was something different, something far worse. The thing was smiling. Its jaw stretched open impossibly wide, wider than a human mouth could ever open, as jagged teeth like rotted stumps gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smile was too wide, too twisted. It felt like a mocking grin, a cruel, predatory gesture. And in that moment, Hunter realized something that made his blood run cold. The thing wasn't just a predator. It was a reflection. It was him. He had been running from the thing outside, but now he understood. The entity wasn't just pulling him in. It was pulling out the parts of him that he had buried deep inside. The grief, the pain, the guilt, the loss. He had come to Alaska to film a wilderness challenge, to survive. But the forest wasn't just interested in his survival. It wanted him to confront what he had buried, the parts of himself he had ignored, the emotions he had repressed. This creature, the forest, it was forcing him to face the darkest corners of his soul, where the true horror resided. Hunter's breath caught in his throat as the thing in front of him shifted. Its body cracked, the sound like bones snapping as it stepped forward. The very air felt charged with an electric tension, an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It's not just a forest, Hunter realized, his mind grappling with the impossible truth. It's a reflection of me, of everything. I've run from... The smile twisted further, widening until it became grotesque, monstrous. It wasn't just a smile, it was an invitation. The thing reached out, its skeletal fingers stretching toward him, and the tendrils behind it swarmed like black serpents, writhing and twisting in the air. Hunter didn't have time to think. He didn't have time to do anything but react. In one desperate motion, he spun and sprinted toward the darkness, away from the creature, away from the twisting, pulling mass of terror. But it was too late. The forest had already claimed him, and He would never leave. Hunter ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale trembling with the weight of the fear pressing down on him, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground. He had no idea where he was going. The forest felt endless, a maze of trees that blurred, together in the blackness, closing in around him like a living thing. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of rot, and something darker, something ancient that gnawed at his very soul. The sound of the creature behind him, its tendrils, dragging through the earth, scraping against bark, was getting closer. It was relentless. It was patient. And it was pulling him deeper, into the heart of the forest where escape would be impossible. He could hear it breathing now, each inhale sharp and ragged, like the slow, terrible rasp of death itself. It's going to catch me. It's going to kill me. He could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him, the last moments of his life, each one stretching into an eternity. But worse than that, the thing that chased him wasn't just a monster. It was something far worse. It was his own mind, his guilt, his grief, his every regret, all manifesting in the form of this grotesque entity. It's me, he thought, his mind spinning in circles. It's always been me. The words were a revelation, but they also twisted the knife deeper. Hunter had run from everything in his life, the painful memories of his past, the tragedy that had shattered his world, but he had never faced them, never confronted the darkness within himself. And now, this forest, this thing, was forcing him to. With every step, the forest seemed to close in tighter around him, its twisted trees bending inward like fingers reaching for him, grasping at, his legs pulling him back into the depths of the darkness. The whispers were deafening now, voices that slithered into his mind like venomous snakes, curling around his thoughts and squeezing the air from his lungs. Hunter. His name, whispered over and over, became a chant, a constant drone that rattled his skull. The trees groaned, their trunks twisting, their branches reaching upward like skeletal hands, desperate to claim him. But then, the voices changed. They were no longer just whispers. They became him. Hunter. Why did you leave me? The voice was unmistakable. It was her voice, his mother's. He stopped in his tracks, his heart stopping with it. His chest tightened painfully as the world around him seemed to collapse. No, he thought, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real. This isn't her. It can't be. But the voice continued. You promised me you'd never leave. You promised. It was like a raw wound being torn open again, that guilt, that weight of loss crashing down on him. The forest, this nightmare, was forcing him to relive it, to feel the pain of losing her all over again. She's dead, Hunter thought, his hands shaking as they gripped his sides. She's gone, and I couldn't save her. I couldn't. I'm still here. The voice rang louder, clearer now, a shadowy presence rising from the dark corners of the forest. It wasn't his mother. It wasn't any real voice. It was a trick. It had to be. But the more he resisted, the more real it became. His legs wobbled, the ground beneath him sinking into the earth like quicksand, as if it too were trying to drag him under. He couldn't breathe. His head spun. The memories of his mother, of the promises he had made, twisted and knotted with the monstrosity now standing in front of him. The figure emerged from the darkness, and this time it was no longer just a twisted version of himself. It had her eyes, his mother's eyes, those dark, sad eyes that had watched him as a child, that had seen the hurt inside of him long before he had ever acknowledged it. It reached out for him, its fingers long and twisted, just like the tendrils from before. But it wasn't a mere shadow anymore. It was the reflection of his regret, the reflection of his failure. It was an extension of everything he had left behind, everything he had ignored. You failed me, the voice echoed in his mind. Hunter, felt his knees give way beneath him. His head hung low as the forest pressed closer, the weight of its darkness suffocating him. There was no escape. There was no running. He had been chasing something that didn't exist, running from something he had been carrying all along. The creature loomed over him, its figure now fully formed. Its limbs were like spindly branches, and its face, a grotesque mixture of his own features and his mother's, grinned down at him with a twisted satisfaction. Its eyes, the hollow pits, stared into him, reaching into his very soul, pulling out his deepest fears, his darkest memories. Hunter collapsed to his hands and knees, the ground slick with the remnants of his own sweat, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. His chest heaved, but there was no air to breathe, no way to escape. "This is what you are," the voice whispered. "This is who you've become." It wasn't just a physical threat. The forest wasn't just after his life. It was after his mind, his spirit, his very essence. And it had claimed him now, twisted him into something else entirely. Something broken. Something consumed by his own failures. Hunter tried to speak, to cry out, but no sound escaped his throat. The air was thick, suffocating, like the earth itself had sealed his fate. And then, just as his vision began to fade, just as the forest seemed to close in around him completely, something shifted. A new voice, sharp and clear, cut through the darkness. "You don't have to die here." Hunter's eyes shot open, his body trembling as the voice echoed in his mind again. This voice wasn't from the forest. It wasn't from the creature. It was his own voice, a voice he hadn't heard in years. His voice, he took a breath, a single ragged gasp. "You can fight this," the voice urged him. Hunter's eyes widened. Fight. The darkness that had been consuming him pulled back, just for a moment. A sliver of light, of hope, broke through the suffocating void. He could feel the ground beneath him solidifying, his legs regaining some strength. "I can fight this." With that single thought, something inside him shifted. The terror, the guilt, the overwhelming weight of the forest's influence started to falter. He had been carrying the weight of his grief for too long. He had been running from his own pain, afraid to face the truth. But now, in this moment, with everything on the line, Hunter understood. He wasn't running from the forest. He was running from himself. And in that instant, Hunter made a choice. He stood. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful. But with every shaky step, he pushed against the overwhelming darkness. His hands trembled, but his resolve hardened. He wasn't going to be consumed. Not by this place. Not by the memories. Not by the things he had buried. "You don't control me," he thought, his voice steady and sure in his mind. "I control me." The forest seemed to pause, like it was waiting for him to break, waiting for him to fall. But Hunter didn't. Instead, he moved forward. Step by step, facing the creature, the entity, the very forest that had tried to break him. And with one final breath, he spoke the words that shattered the illusion. "I forgive myself." The ground beneath him trembled, as though the forest itself had recoiled. The tendrils stopped their writhing. The figure, his mother's twisted form, halted in its tracks. The darkness seemed to recoil, the tendrils of fear retreating into the depths from which they had risen. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The forest was silent. Hunter stood alone in the clearing, breathing deeply, his chest heavy, but no longer suffocating. The air felt different now, fresher, lighter. The forest was still there, but its presence no longer felt malevolent. It had taken everything from him, but in doing so, it had forced him to face the truth. And now, for the first time, he was free. The forest is silent, but the echoes of Hunter's internal battle linger in the air. He's left not with a physical escape, but with a psychological freedom, a new understanding of his own struggles, guilt, and the power he has over his own destiny. The supernatural entity may have been a reflection of his fears, but in the end, it was his ability to confront and accept them that allowed him to reclaim his life. A new chapter begins, but Hunter will never forget the forest that nearly consumed him and the strength he found within himself to survive. The silence of the forest was deafening. It felt like a veil had been lifted, one that had held Hunter in a crushing, suffocating grip for days. The tendrils, the whispers, the terrible presence, all of it was gone. The forest had released him, and for a fleeting moment he thought he might be free. He took a tentative step forward. The ground beneath his boots felt solid now, no longer pulsing with malevolent energy, no longer shifting and treacherous. The trees around him, though still tall and foreboding, no longer loomed like a cage. They stood as they always had, ancient and unyielding, but now, somehow, ordinary. Hunter exhaled deeply, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel relief, to let the weight of his fears slip off his shoulders. He had survived the entity. He had faced his deepest, darkest memories and had come out alive. But as the stillness settled around him, something gnawed at the back of his mind, a quiet, persistent thought that wouldn't let go. Was it really over? The questions swirled in his mind as he turned toward the path he had been running down, the path back to the campsite, back to where it all began, the place where he had set up his camera, where he had encountered the first signs of the unnatural presence. He had to leave. The forest had given him a final cruel gift, freedom, but at what cost? His hand gripped the strap of his pack, the heavy weight of it a reminder that he had not come out of this unscathed. He hadn't really escaped. He'd only walked away from the terror for now. Hadn't he? Hunter moved cautiously, but with purpose, as if the very ground could betray him at any moment. He tried to focus on the rational part of his mind, the part that said he had learned something valuable, something transformative from this experience. He had faced the beast that haunted him. He had faced himself. And yet, something was still wrong. The further he walked, the more the forest began to feel different. The trees no longer felt like mere spectators. Now they felt like watchful sentinels, their boughs arching higher than before, their shadows darker and deeper. They were leaning in, inching closer. Hunter shook his head, forcing himself to dismiss the feeling. He was overthinking it. The entity was gone. He had conquered his fears, and yet... His feet moved faster, the pace quickening as he approached the clearing where his campsite had once stood. A creeping unease wrapped itself around his chest. The fire pit, the strange, too warm fire pit from the first night. The odd sense that something had been waiting for him. And when he reached the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. The fire pit was still there. But there was something else. The charred wood that had once been smouldering had been disturbed, scattered outwards, as if someone or something had tried to rebuild it, or perhaps just hide something. Hunter dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the earth, brushing aside the ashes and debris. Beneath it, he found a small, shiny object, a fragment of metal. It was round and smooth, the kind of thing that might have been part of a knife or some other tool, though now it was twisted, warped, and partially buried in the dirt. His pulse quickened. That wasn't there before. He glanced around the clearing, his eyes narrowing. Something was off. A soft crackle of leaves underfoot, a snap of a twig from deep in the woods. He wasn't alone. And then, there it was again. A figure, just at the edge of his vision, a movement in the shadows. He jerked his head around, but nothing was there. The forest was still, too still. Hunter's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. No, He had been alone. He was sure of it. The thing, the entity, was gone. But what if it never left? He backed away from the fire pit, his eyes darting between the trees, the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. The wind had stopped entirely. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Then, a whisper. "Hunter." The sound came from everywhere, a voice low and cold, curling around him like a noose. He spun on his heels, his hand instinctively reaching for his backpack as if it could protect him. But there was nothing there, nothing to fight. The voice was all around him now, its cadence rhythmic, like a chant, a prayer. "Hunter." "We never left." Hunter froze. He knew that voice. It was his own. A chill ran down his spine as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His reflection, his twisted image in the dark. He could feel the weight of the words pressing on him, pushing him into the earth, forcing him to relive the horror of the forest, of the creature, of his own fractured mind. The trees closed in tighter. Their branches began to sway, not from the wind, but from a force far darker. And then, through the thick shadows, the figure emerged again. It was him. Or it looked like him. A shadow, a silhouette, a distorted reflection of himself, its face pale, stretched, as if the very air was pulling it thin. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent ethereal light. His eyes. Hunter's breath hitched. This is it. It's not over. The entity was still with him. The forest was still with him. And it was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just his guilt, it wasn't just his grief, it was him. The parts of himself that he hadn't seen, that he hadn't faced before. The pieces of his soul that had been twisted by fear, by loss, by isolation. "We will never leave, Hunter. We are you." The creature, the reflection of him, took a step forward. Then another. The ground seemed to tremble with every movement. Hunter could feel the weight of it all. The truth, the terror, bearing down on him. It's not the forest. He realized now, with a terrible clarity, that he hadn't been running from the forest at all. He had been running from himself. And no matter how far he went, no matter how much he tried to escape, the darkness would always find him. Because it wasn't in the trees, it wasn't in the entity, it was inside him. Hunter's fight was far from over. The creature, his reflection, would not release him so easily. The forest had never been the source of his terror. It had simply drawn out the parts of him that were already broken. And now, as he stood in the clearing, Hunter realized the true horror was the fact that he would never be free of what lived within him. The shadows in the forest grew longer, stretching like fingers to cradle the earth. Hunter stood frozen, his gaze locked on the figure before him, the twisted reflection of himself, that pale, distorted version of his own face. The thing's eyes shimmered, a sickly, ethereal glow that made the forest seem colder, darker. For a moment, time felt like it had stopped. Hunter's breath caught in his chest. The wind was still, the trees were silent. And the creature stood there, silent as well. But its presence was 1,000 times louder than any storm. The reflection, the entity, moved again, and with every shift, the ground beneath Hunter's feet seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself were shaking in fear. His own reflection, his own fears. It's not real, he thought. It's just a trick, just my mind playing games with me. But the longer he stared at it, the more he realized the horror of the truth. It's not just my mind. It's me. It reached out for him, its fingers long and twitching like grotesque branches. Its movements were slow, deliberate. Every inch it moved, Hunter could feel his stomach churn with a cold terror, his pulse hammering in his throat. The reflection was coming closer. He stumbled backward, his legs unsteady, but the air around him felt thick. The forest closed in tighter. The trees were no longer just trees. They felt alive, watching, judging. The darkness pressed against his skin, suffocating him. His chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of dread. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey. All he could do was stare as the creature crept closer, its eyes gleaming with a terrible understanding. Hunter shook his head violently, snapping out of the trance the reflection had put him in. "This is just in my head," he thought desperately. "This isn't real. It's all a trick." But the creature was still there, its voice a soft whisper that echoed in his ears. "We are one. You cannot escape us." "No," Hunter thought again, his legs finally moving. His instincts screamed at him to get away, but every time he tried to turn, the ground seemed to shift beneath him, as though the earth itself was conspiring to keep him in place. The forest was alive and it was trapping him. His breath came in shallow gasps. "I need to break free. I need to think. And then it hit him. His camera, the trail camera. It had been recording everything, hadn't it? The footage, the one thing he hadn't yet reviewed, the one piece of evidence that could show him the truth. His hand instinctively reached for the pack at his back, pulling the camera free with frantic movements. His fingers were slick with sweat as he pressed the buttons to review the footage. The screen flickered to life. The first image was clear, just the campsite, the empty woods, the fire pit. Nothing out of place. But then, in the second frame, his heart skipped a beat. The creature was there, the distorted figure. But the real horror was what followed. It wasn't just standing there. It wasn't merely observing him from a distance. The creature, his reflection, was moving, mimicking his every action. Its every gesture was an exact copy of his own, as though it had been waiting for him to make the first move. Hunter's hands were shaking, but he forced himself to keep watching. The creature's face on the screen twisted into a grotesque smile, and then the screen fuzzed out. In that moment, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, snapped him out of his reverie. He whipped his head around. It was there. Closer now. It's not just a reflection. It's this. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The creature wasn't a mere hallucination. It wasn't just his inner fears made flesh. It had always been there, stalking him from the very first moment he set foot in this forest. It was connected to him, bound to him. It had been feeding off him, his doubts, his regrets, his self-loathing, and now it was ready to claim him completely. His heart hammered as he fumbled to turn off the camera, to shut down the last remnants of his perception. But his hand froze halfway. The reflection wasn't just mimicking him, it was learning. As it closed in on him, its smile widened, its eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. It reached out, fingers trembling like branches of a dead tree, its grip tightening with each step it took toward him. The world around Hunter blurred as he backed away further, tripping over rocks and roots. His mind screamed at him to keep running, but his body, his weak, exhausted body, was rebelling. It was as though the forest was drawing him in, as if the very trees themselves were constricting around him. "You are mine," the reflection's voice echoed, reverberating in his mind. "You have always been mine." Hunter's hands clutched at his chest, the weight of its words dragging him lower until he was on his knees in the dirt. His breath was ragged, his body shaking uncontrollably. It was too much. The forest, the entity, himself. He was caught in a spiral of self-doubt and terror, unable to break free. But just as he thought he might lose himself completely to the darkness, a thought cut through the haze of fear. It's not real. The truth slammed into him with the force of a train. This wasn't just about surviving the forest. This wasn't about running from his past. It wasn't about confronting the creature. It was about facing himself, accepting what had been done, what had been left undone, his grief, his guilt, his mistakes. He had spent his entire life avoiding the truth, pushing away the pain, the fear, the failure. But the forest, this reflection, the creature, it had come to show him that he could never escape. It would follow him everywhere, waiting for him to accept it, waiting for him to accept himself. The creature paused, its twisted face looming over him, the sickly grin still stretched wide. "You can't escape us. You will never be free." Hunter looked into its eyes, into his own eyes, and for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt understanding. This wasn't something to run from. This wasn't something to defeat. This was something he had to accept. The darkness pressed around him, the weight of his past, his failures and his guilt. But it didn't crush him. For the first time, he didn't resist it. He let it in. And when he did, the creature's smile faltered. Hunter closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, and the creature shuddered, its form wavering as though something inside it was unraveling. The forest seemed to pause. He opened his eyes again, and the reflection was gone. The air was still, the trees no longer leaning toward him. The oppressive weight had lifted. The creature had vanished. The forest was still, silent, empty. Hunter stood up slowly, his hands shaking, his heart still pounding in his chest. But the feeling was different now. It wasn't terror. It wasn't dread. It was peace. Hunter took one last look at the clearing, the campsite, the fire pit, the trail camera. And then, without a second thought, he turned and began walking away. The forest seemed to release him with every step he took. He wasn't sure where he was going. The path ahead was unclear, but it didn't matter anymore. He had faced his demons. The forest had tried to consume him. But in the end, he had consumed it instead. The trees around Hunter no longer seemed to shift in the corners of his eyes. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had clung to the forest was gone. There was a moment, a fleeting, fragile moment, when it felt like the air itself had lightened. The unnatural silence had dissolved, leaving only the sounds of the natural world in its wake. The occasional chirp of a bird, the distant rush of wind through the canopy. Hunter breathed deeply, feeling the cool, fresh air fill his lungs, a sharp contrast to the thick, stifling atmosphere that had choked him before. His feet carried him forward, almost without thought, following the worn path through the forest. He barely noticed the sharp pain in his legs, the cuts on his arms, or the fatigue that pulled at him with each step. All that mattered was that he was moving. He was away from it all. Or so he thought. As he trekked through the forest, each step echoing in the stillness, he could feel the forest begin to shift once again. Not in the way it had before, not in the oppressive, malevolent way, but in the subtle way of something watching, something waiting. Hunter's skin prickled, his heartbeat sped up. The calm that had settled over him was beginning to feel false. He stopped suddenly, his breath catching in his throat. A sound, a soft rustling, not far ahead. A sound too familiar. No. His heart slammed against his chest as his mind reeled back to that first night when the forest had seemed to come alive with that eerie, unnatural presence. He had heard this before. The soft scrape of feet on underbrush, the rustle of branches shifting, the snap of twigs in the distance. Only this time, it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. Hunter's legs froze. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his body refused to move. He turned, slowly, eyes scanning the dense underbrush, hoping it was nothing, hoping that it was just an animal. just an animal. But there, through the trees, just beyond the reach of his sight, he saw something move, a shape, a figure. He squinted, his vision narrowing as the figure grew clearer. A man. A figure wrapped in the shadows of the trees. It was standing still, watching him. His breath hitched. It can't be. It just can't be. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, its silhouette hidden in the dense foliage. Hunter took a hesitant step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his leg. This is real. This is real. It's not the reflection. It's not a hallucination. It's someone else. He moved closer, his footsteps tentative, as if afraid that the mere sound of his movement would cause the figure to vanish. His mind screamed at him to stay away, to run, but something held him in place. Something tethered him to that figure. Why does it feel like... This is supposed to happen? He took another step. His heart raced. The figure remained perfectly still, as if it were a part of the very forest itself, rooted to the ground. Hunter's pulse quickened. There was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. His mind tried to grasp at the familiarity of the shape, the posture, the stillness. The figure was too still. It was too perfect in its position. His stomach twisted, and dread flooded his veins as he suddenly realized the truth. The figure wasn't waiting for him. It was waiting for someone else. And then the air around him thickened again, heavy with an energy he had felt before. That same oppressive weight, the same feeling that had haunted him in the early days of his trek into the wilderness. No, not again. The air crackled as the figure began to shift, the shadowy form flickering in the low light of the forest. It moved, but it didn't move like a human. The movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were a puppet on strings. Hunter's legs quaked beneath him. He stumbled backward, his mind racing for answers, but there were no answers. Not here, not in this forest. The figure began to approach, its feet scraping over the dirt with a sound like rustling leaves. The closer it came, the more. Its features came into focus. Its face was hidden, just like his reflection, just like the entity that had stalked him. It was distorted, like a warped version of someone he should have known. The eyes, those eyes, glowed with that same sickly pale light. And then it spoke. "You're not alone." The voice was deep, hollow like an echo from somewhere far, far away. The voice came from the figure, but it was wrong. It didn't match the mouth's movements. It seemed to reverberate from every corner of the forest, vibrating in the very air. Hunter stepped back again, his breath coming in short. Panicked gasps. "Who are you?" His voice sounded strange, distant, as if it wasn't even his own. The figure's mouth twitched into something resembling a smile, but it was empty, a grotesque mimicry of a human expression. "You know who we are?" Hunter's chest tightened, his head spinning. The words rang through him like a bell, pulling his thoughts into a whirlpool. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run, but the forest, this place, was still. There was no escape. "You're still trapped here, Hunter." The voice grew colder, more insistent, and in that instant, a terrible realization gnawed at Hunter's mind. The reflection, the entity, the thing in the forest. It was never just the forest itself. It was his fear, his broken pieces, scattered and personified. It had grown stronger as he had gotten weaker. It had followed him, always waiting for him to break down, and now, the forest was no longer just a physical place. It had become an extension of his mind. The figure, his reflection, was just another piece of the web that had woven itself around him. The real danger wasn't the forest. The real danger was what it had become, and just as Hunter realized this, The figure began to dissolve into the shadows, fading in and out of existence. "We're still here." The voice echoed once more, this time faint, lost in the growing darkness. Hunter dropped to his knees, the weight of the truth crashing over him like an avalanche. He had survived the forest, but in doing so, he had become a part of it. The journey was never just about the forest. It was about him, about breaking free from the parts of himself that had been trapped within this place. But the forest had grown with him. The shadows, the reflection, they had all fed off him. And now they would never truly leave. The forest was always inside him. The realization was suffocating. The figure had left him with a final chilling whisper before it vanished, completely into the woods. "You will never be free, Hunter." Hunter sat in the middle of the clearing, the weight of the forest heavy on his chest. He was no longer sure if he was in the woods or if the woods were inside him. The very thought that he could never escape, that it would follow him forever, gnawed at his spirit. Was this the true horror of the forest? Was this the terrible, cruel truth he'd been running from all along? Would he ever truly be free? The ground beneath Hunter's feet felt cold, unforgiving. The forest, though still as ever, was no longer just an external world around him. It had become part of him, inside him, seeping into his skin like the damp air that hung between the mighty trees. Each breath he drew seemed to draw in the weight of the forest, thick with the smell of moss and decay, the whispers of the past rattling in his ears. He was no longer sure how much time had passed. Was it minutes, hours, days? The forest had no sense of time. It was timeless, endless, a shifting mass of shadow and silence. He could hear the birds again, chirping somewhere far off, but their calls seemed distant, muffled by the thick veil that hung between him and the world he used to know. Escape. It seemed so distant, so impossible now. He wasn't sure where he was running to anymore. The physical trail ahead had long since blurred into an impenetrable fog. The trees weren't just trees, they were memories. The underbrush wasn't just underbrush, it was regret. Every corner of the woods, every gust of wind, every crackle of leaves beneath his feet, all carried the weight of something he couldn't name, but had always known. The forest is inside me. Hunter's fingers clenched around the knife in his hand, but it was no longer an instrument of survival. It felt hollow, useless. The blade could no longer sever the ties between him and the forest. It couldn't cut through the suffocating layers of guilt and fear that now entwined him. His mind flashed back to the moments before he had left his campsite, when he had stared into the reflection in the firelight. That grotesque copy of himself, smiling, mocking every decision he had ever made, every failure, every misstep. The thing had only wanted one thing, for him to acknowledge it. "I am not alone," it had said. But the truth was worse. The reflection wasn't a separate entity. It had been inside him all along, the part of him that had festered, that had hidden in the corners of his mind. It wasn't a thing to defeat, it was something to accept, to integrate. That was the horror. And now it had claimed him. Hunter pushed through the thicket, his legs moving on autopilot. His mind buzzed with thoughts too disjointed to make sense of. But there was one thought that continued to echo in his mind, like a haunting refrain. "You're still here." The voice of the forest, the reflection, the thing in the woods. And then, without warning, he heard it again, a soft snap, like the breaking of a twig, a distant crack that echoed in the silence of the trees. Hunter froze. His pulse quickened. His heart began to pound so loud it drowned out everything else. His breathing grew shallow, ragged. No. No. Not again. He looked around, his eyes frantic, scanning every direction. The forest was still, too still. The breeze had stopped. The birds had fallen silent. There was only the sound of his own heartbeat, thudding in his ears, louder than anything else. Another snap. Closer this time. It's not real. Hunter shook his head violently, trying to banish the thought, to push away the rising tide of panic. It's just the forest, just the sound of nature. There's nothing here. But then he saw it. A figure, flickering in the corner of his vision. Hunter whipped his head toward it, but it was gone. He staggered backward, his breath caught in his throat. There it was again, a flash of movement, just outside his direct line of sight. The figure seemed to dance in and out of the shadows like a wraith, impossibly quick, just beyond his reach. It wasn't the same thing he'd seen earlier. No, this was different. This figure was lighter, agile, unseen, a shadow in the dark. Hunter's breath hitched, and for a moment the blood drained from his face. His chest tightened with the familiar weight of dread. But this time it wasn't just fear. It was recognition, a horrible, sinking knowing. The forest hadn't just become part of him. He had become part of the forest, the shadow he saw now. It was his shadow, or at least something that was him, something that moved when he wasn't watching, something that had always been there, waiting, silent, just out of sight. He turned in a frantic circle, but the forest had shifted. The trees, the shadows, the underbrush, they all seemed to close in around him. The distant sound of leaves rustling, the snap of twigs. Everything had conspired to drown out his thoughts. But then, just as before, he heard the whisper. "You cannot escape." The voice was faint, a hiss through the wind. It was not a human voice, not something that could be easily understood. It was a presence, lingering just beneath the surface of the trees, just beneath the surface of his mind. It wasn't a voice that existed in the world. It was a voice that existed inside the forest, inside him. Hunter's hands trembled. He could feel the pulse of the forest now, like the heartbeat of something ancient and hungry. The same hunger he
had felt since the moment he had first arrived. You can't outrun it. It was him.
It was the forest. It was everything, the past, the reflection, the memories, the mistakes. All of it was closing in on him. Hunter stumbled backward, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to push through the thick branches, the bushes, but the woods didn't open up. They pressed tighter, suffocating him. Then, through the choking darkness, something touched him. Cold. A cold hand on his shoulder. Hunter whirled, but no one was there. The shadow moved again, slipping between the trees like smoke, its form indistinct and twisted. He was losing himself. He was losing his mind, his grip on what was real and what was illusion. The forest had made him part of it, and now he could never escape. This is not real. This is not real. The mantra repeated in his mind, but it was hollow now. Everything had become part of the nightmare. Hunter stood frozen in place, unable to move, his legs shaking beneath him. He could hear the whisper again, clearer now, and it echoed in his head, reverberating through every inch of his skin. "You're never alone, Hunter." He wasn't sure when he started running. His legs carried him forward without his consent, tearing through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and branches. The trees blurred past him in a dizzying whirlwind of green and brown. But the shadow followed him, slipping through the cracks in his vision, always just behind him. Hunter's breath was ragged, the weight of his past, of the forest, of his own. Reflection, all of it, bearing down on him, collapsing him inward. He wasn't sure where he was going. He wasn't sure what he was doing anymore. The world had fractured into pieces. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a state of mind, and now there was no way back. The ground beneath his feet gave way. Hunter stumbled, his feet falling into a sudden dip in the earth. He tumbled, falling into the dirt, the wind knocked out of him. And then, a voice. Soft. Faint. So close. "You belong to us." Hunter gasped for air, his body trembling violently. The shadow was upon him now, crawling from the earth, from the very dirt beneath him. His last thought before the darkness consumed him was, there is no escape. There never was. Hunter's world had become one of darkness and smoke. The forest had swallowed him whole, each tree, each shadow an extension of his fractured mind. It no longer felt like he was walking through a forest at all. No, it felt like he was lost, inside the very corridors of his own soul, each step another echo, another door closing on him. He was deep inside now, lost in a space that existed between the real world and something far darker. The air was thick with something other. It had stopped feeling like a place. It had stopped feeling like time. It was just him. His skin crawled as the darkness pressed in. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every distant rustle of leaves felt deliberate, like it was meant for him. He could feel the weight of eyes upon him, though he couldn't see a soul. He didn't need to. He knew what was watching him. The forest, his reflection, the shadow that had followed him. And then there was a sound, a soft shuffle, like something dragging its feet through the dirt, slow and deliberate, never hurried. Hunter's breath caught in his throat. It was close, so close. He could hear it, feel it, right behind him. He spun around, the knife raised instinctively in his hand, but there was nothing, no figure, no shadow, only the same ancient trees, their gnarled limbs stretching out toward him like cold fingers, was still there. He could feel it, creeping at the edges of his awareness. He could feel the pulse of the forest, the slow rhythm of its heartbeat. It was alive. It was always alive. And it was feeding on his fear. Hunter's knees buckled beneath him. He hit the ground hard, the cool dirt scraping against his palms. His breath came in gasps, erratic and shallow, as he tried to push himself to his feet. His head spun. The world around him twisted in on itself, bending at the corners, blurring into shadows. This isn't real. He kept repeating it, over and over. But the words weren't enough to drown out the sound that had now started to grow louder. The shuffle, the dragging of something through the forest floor. Something was coming closer. Hunter's heart pounded in his chest as he staggered back to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, unsteady, unwilling to carry him any farther. The forest had become a labyrinth of fear, every path he tried leading him deeper into madness. Is this the end? He felt the coldness again, the coldness of something pressing against his mind, something he couldn't escape. The thing, his shadow, had become his only reality now. He had no choice but to follow its path, to accept that it was his fate. Another shuffle. This time, Hunter couldn't stop himself. His body moved on its own, pulled by an invisible force, his feet crunching through the underbrush. The sound of dragging grew louder, more insistent, more terrifying. The air seemed to press in, the trees seeming to lean toward him, their twisted limbs reaching like claws. It was suffocating. Every breath felt like it was being stolen from him, and then, just ahead, he saw it, a flicker in the darkness, a faint movement at the edge of his vision. Hunter froze. The silhouette of someone. The figure, cloaked in shadows, appeared as if it had materialized from the very earth itself. It was tall, gaunt, and its presence radiated an oppressive, bone-chilling cold. Hunter couldn't breathe, his body locked up, his heart thrumming wildly in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't listen. He could only stand there, staring at the figure, his mind screaming. The figure didn't move. It simply watched him, Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in the blackness of the forest, obscured by the unnatural shadows that had taken over this place. But Hunter knew. He knew what it was. It was him, the reflection, the same twisted, mocking version of himself that had haunted him since the beginning. Only now, it wasn't just his reflection. It was the forest. It was everything. His every regret, every fear, every mistake, standing right before him. It was as if the forest had peeled back the layers of his soul and forced him to confront every part of himself he had buried deep. "You are not alone." The voice was a low whisper, carried by the wind, and yet it felt like it was inside his head. It was him. It was always him. The fear, the doubts, the guilt, it had all been waiting right here in the shadows. The figure stepped forward, but its movements weren't fluid. They were stiff, jerking like a marionette on strings, as if its body was struggling against some unseen force. It came closer, its presence filling the space around Hunter, drowning out everything else. The air grew thick, suffocating. "You've been running for so long, but you can't outrun yourself." The words felt like a punch to his gut. The voice. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of his own thoughts, twisted and distorted, echoing in his mind. Hunter wanted to scream. He wanted to fight, to push back, but the fear, the terror, had paralyzed him. His limbs refused to obey. The shadows, the forest, the reflection. It was all too much. He was drowning in it. The figure was closer now. So close that Hunter could feel the coldness radiating off of it. Its face, no, its lack of face, was an endless void. Just darkness. No eyes, no mouth, just empty. An abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. And then it reached out, a long, skeletal hand stretching toward him. Hunter's body finally responded. He lunged backward, his feet scrambling for purchase, his heart thudding in his chest. But the figure moved faster than he ever could, its hand brushing against his arm with an icy touch, and in that instant, everything stopped. The world, the forest, the shadows, they all froze. Hunter felt something shift in him. A pressure, a weight, like a door that had been slammed shut in his mind. And then he understood. The truth he had been running from all this time. The thing that had been chasing him. The thing that had hunted him through this endless dark forest. It wasn't the forest. It wasn't the reflection. It was himself. The forest had been pulling him deeper, forcing him to face what he had always denied. His own guilt, his grief, his fear. All of it, wrapped in the dark shape of the thing. Before him, the entity had been inside him all along, feeding on his every doubt, every regret, every misstep. Hunter's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. The weight of it all, the truth, crushed him. He had always been running, always pushing it away, but it was him. It had always been him. And now, the forest, the reflection, had claimed him. You cannot outrun yourself, Hunter. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar, a crash. It filled his ears, his head, his very soul. The shadows closed, in tighter, and the figure loomed above him, its dark, featureless face a mirror of all his sins. And in that final, suffocating moment, Hunter realized there was no escape. Not from the forest, not from the reflection, and not from himself. Hunter's body lay crumpled on the forest floor, the cold soil pressing against his back like the weight of the earth itself. His mind was a twisted labyrinth, a chaotic swirl of thoughts too shattered to comprehend. He had collapsed, broken, not by the figure that loomed over him, but by something far worse, himself. The shadows around him thickened, growing taller, stretching their dark limbs like an ancient, endless reaching. The forest was alive, but not in any natural sense. It was alive in the way a nightmare is alive, more real than reality itself. The trees, the soil, the air, they were all part of him. They were born from his guilt, his fear, his need to escape. But now, there was nowhere left to run, no safe place, no exit. The figure stood over him, unmoving. It was him. It was the reflection, his darkest self given form. The hollow eyes, the twisted grin that wasn't a grin at all, just the dark stretch of nothingness where a mouth should be. The darkness around it was like a wound in the universe, a black hole sucking in the light. It was so close now, it felt as if the entire world was pressing in from every side, suffocating him with its weight. His breath came in ragged gasps, but they couldn't outrun the inevitable. Inevitable. You've always known, Hunter. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was deep, resonant, powerful, and it vibrated in the very air around him. It echoed through his bones, through his very being. Hunter's eyes, wide with fear and understanding, locked onto the figure. His heart thundered in his chest. But even that sound seemed far away, as if he were detached from his own body. You're not just afraid of the forest, you're afraid of you, afraid of what's inside, afraid of what you did, afraid of what you couldn't save. The words tore into him, each one a searing truth, each one a blade carving through the fragile veil of the world he had built. The guilt, the shame, the memories of the past, all of it rose within him, like a poison he had been trying to outrun for years. The reflection, the shadow him, had always been here. Not in the forest, not in the trees or the mist, not even in the figure standing above him. It had been inside him the whole time. The days of his life were passing before his eyes now, moments long buried under layers of denial. His father's disappointed gaze, his mother's silent tears, the friends he had abandoned, the people he had let down. Every face, every whispered word, every broken promise. And then, the one thing that had been buried deeper than all the rest. The death of his younger brother, Luke. The accident. The one thing Hunter could never bring himself to face. The memory cut through him like a jagged shard. It was the one moment in his life that had shattered him completely. That had caused him to flee into the wilderness. The moment that had driven him to become a YouTuber. To isolate himself from the world. To prove something. To run from the guilt. Luke's voice echoed in his ears. "You promised, Hunter. You promised you'd keep me safe." Hunter had been there, had seen it all. Luke had been on the edge of the cliff, laughing, fearless, just a kid. And Hunter had told him to step back, to be careful. But Luke hadn't listened. The next moment, the ground had given way beneath him. The silence that followed had been louder than any sound. Hunter hadn't been able to save him. The shadow leaned closer, its hollow gaze locking onto Hunter's eyes. The forest closed in tighter, the darkness swallowing the light. It's too late to save him now. It's too late to save anyone. The words hit him like a wave, crashing over his chest, crushing him with their finality. The grief, the helplessness, it was all a part of him now. The shadow, the forest. It was the manifestation of his own soul's darkest corners. It wasn't just there. It was him. It had always been him. Hunter's hands trembled, his fingers digging into the earth. His entire body was shaking with the weight of it all. The forest around him seemed to press against him now, the trees looming like silent witnesses to the destruction of his mind. It was suffocating, maddening, but then a small voice broke through the chaos. "Hunter." It was soft, weak, familiar. Hunter's heart skipped a beat, a thread of hope pulling him toward the sound. "Luke," he whispered hoarsely. His voice cracked from the weight of tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed. His body jerked upward, a desperate surge of life pushing against the suffocating shadow of his guilt. The forest grew even darker, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The shadows twisted, and the figure before him, the reflection, seemed to shudder, its form wavering, uncertain. "It's not real." The voice came again, clearer now. The figure hissed, its form flickering, distorting. The very air seemed to pulse with the conflict between Hunter's grief and his will to break free. The whisper, Luke's voice, called out again. "Hunter, I'm not gone. You can save me." The shadow recoiled as if struck, a hiss of frustration filling the air. It tried to move, but now something in Hunter's chest burned, a sense of clarity, a realization. He wasn't just running from the forest. He wasn't just running from the shadow. He had been running from himself, from the guilt, the pain, the darkness he had buried so deep. But the forest was not his enemy. The reflection was not his enemy. He was his own enemy. Hunter's trembling hands reached into the darkness, pulling the blade from his belt, holding it high. The forest seemed to breathe with him, as if it too recognized the shift. The trees, once oppressive, now felt like ancient, witnesses to the struggle of his soul. "You don't belong to me." Hunter's voice broke through the darkness. Steady now. "I'm not your prisoner." And in that moment, the forest responded. The shadows screamed, a high-pitched wail that shattered the night. But it wasn't just a sound. It was a release. The air snapped back into focus. The oppressive weight lifted. The trees, once suffocating, now felt distant, their branches gentle. The fog that had clung to his skin now began to dissipate. The figure, the reflection, vanished, disappearing into the thin air from which it had emerged. The forest began to loosen its grip, the earth softening beneath him. The cold lifted. The oppressive silence broke, replaced by the soft sounds of the wilderness. Real, natural, alive. Hunter stood there for a long moment, staring into the empty space where the figure had been. The world was still dark, but now it was different. The shadows, though still present, no longer felt like they were closing in. The weight had lifted. The forest had surrendered to him. The sun broke through the canopy above, casting a pale light through the trees. Hunter blinked, his eyes adjusting to the shift, and for the first time since he had arrived in this place, he felt the warmth of the world. The ground beneath him felt solid. His breath, though still heavy, didn't feel like it was being stolen away. The forest wasn't his enemy. It was never his enemy. It was simply a reflection of him, a reflection he had learned to accept. And so, in the quiet of the Tongass National Forest, Hunter stood alone. But now he wasn't running. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't searching for some way out of the forest or the endless night of his own mind. He had faced what lay inside him, the darkest parts of himself, and now he was free. The reflection was gone. The forest had released him. The guilt, the grief, it was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had faced it. He had survived, and for the first time in years, Hunter knew he was no longer lost. He was home.